Hello everybody, my name is Dave Jackson, and this is Tales from the Backlog, where each week I'm joined by a guest to bring a game out of the backlog, play it, and discuss. My guest today is a friend of the show, a writer for the Astrolabe newsletter, and as well as lots of online publications. You may have read his writing on Wired, EGM, IGN, and many more. He's also the author of the book Fight Magic Items and a blacksmithing enthusiast. Welcome to the show, Aidan Moher.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me today. I am excited.
Yeah, we have a really special game. I know you're a lover of RPGs, and we found a good one that both of us are playing for the first time, I think. So today we're going to talk about Vagrant Story, which is an RPG developed and published by Square for the PlayStation in the year 2000. Gonna fight the urge to do the old Conan O'Brien in the year 2000 bit here. So in the year 2000, it was directed and produced and designed by Yasumi Matsuno, who we're going to talk about some other games that Matsuno was involved in our personal history section here, but remember the name. If this is your first time listening to the show, first of all, thank you for stopping by. Here's how spoilers work. We're not going to spoil the story of Vagrant Story for a while. We will save that for the dedicated spoiler section in the back half of the episode. There will be a timestamp down in the show notes for when spoilers begin. So if you have not played, don't want to know what happens in the story, you can still listen for a while. So you're safe for now. What is Vagrant Story? We have some quick elevator pitches for the top of the show. I say that Vagrant Story is a stats and equipment sickos RPG dream with great vibes. Aidan, what would you say?
I'd call it a stealth single character strategy game with one of the best localizations of all time.
Perfect. Yeah. Lots to talk about. A lot of strong presentation, localization, like you said, and then that strategy, RPG, equipment aspect is hitting for a lot of people as well. Did it hit for us though? We'll find out. Stats before we get too deep into it. I played this emulated on Steam Deck as it has not been re-released anywhere where I can buy it. 26 hours to roll credits on Vagrant Story. How did you play this, and how long did it take you?
Yeah, I played on my my PlayStation disc on PlayStation 2 on a CRT, just same way we would have way back in the day. 25 years ago when it came out. It took me about 39 hours, but a fair bit of that was just like idle time, you know what? Idle time and menu time, which we'll get to as well. But
yes,
but yeah, it can really vary depending on how deep you get into like really fiddling with the systems, I think.
There's also a fair bit of backtracking if you really want to, go find all the stuff. There's a New Game Plus mode where you can find new items and fight new bosses and stuff like that. So good. Play the original way. And there was something about this game's presentation that like I threw a CRT filter on the Steam Deck. I never put CRT filters on emulators, but this one felt like I just want a little bit extra. And, they don't look exactly like a CRT, but close enough. Still looked really cool for sure.
Yeah, it's a beautiful game and like just stretches what the PlayStation was doing at the time, and it's remarkable. I expect we'll talk more about that later.
100%. Yeah. Let's rewind though before we get too deep into it. Let's talk about our histories with interesting here. We can talk about our history with Vagrant Story, of course, when we first played it, which, may have been very recently. But also since this is part of a kind of an unofficial trilogy or extended series, the games that are in this Ivalice setting that Matsuno is known for. So Aidan, have you played some of these other games, Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy 12? And then what was it that drew you to want to play Vagrant Story?
Yeah, so I was big into like Squaresoft games, I guess Square Enix now. Back in the day, I played Final Fantasy Tactics endlessly, played Final Fantasy 12 when it came out, played the remaster when it came out. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, all of those, like in the fake Ivalice. So I was, always on top of the Ivalice stuff from back at the very beginning. In fact, like before a lot of other people, because my first exposure to it was one of my best friends. We were into video games together. His stepbrother went to Thailand and came back with a bootleg copy of Final Fantasy Tactics in Japanese before it was like localized and released in North America. And so
Mhm.
we watched him play like in Japanese, hours and hours and hours of tactics.
Nice.
And he beat it in Japanese. He doesn't know any Japanese, but he's, he slogged his way through and he beat it. And so, we
Mhm.
didn't know the story. We didn't understand, but all the kind of like, crunchy sound effects and the beautiful graphics and the tag, like it was all there.
Mhm.
And we really enjoyed that. And, Matsuno and what he was doing, going back to like Ogre Battle, which I also really liked, rented a ton as a kid, even though I didn't understand it. Just that sort of vibe, that, style of storytelling and world building that he does is so unique in games now, but especially back then. And so
Mhm.
Evilise just, it felt like something that really stood out as a intentional, with intentionality in a way that a lot of series or video games don't always hit.
Mhm.
But I missed Vagrant Story back in the day. I think one of my friends had it. I don't know. I don't know why I didn't play it way back when. This was my first time playing it. And so,
Mhm.
it has a reputation for being hard and grindy and
Yeah.
difficult to understand, like all those things. And that, I think, always kind of kept me away from it. I'd play the first 30 minutes and it would feel a little clunky and the story would feel overwhelming. And I just would never commit to it. And so you asked me to pick a game off a big list of games, and Vagrant
Yeah.
Story hadn't been there. I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it. This will force me to play Vagrant Story.
Mhm.
And I said, even if I have to, because I knew it had New Game Plus, even if I have to download like a save file with like a maxed out character or whatever, make it easy on me, burn through the game. And then I started playing, and then I could not stop playing.
Yeah.
And I have not been this obsessed with a PlayStation game since Final Fantasy 9. Like,
Ooh.
it was like being back in high school, just like glued to my PlayStation,
Hell
which
yeah.
is not what I expected. I knew I would like Vagrant Story. I would respect Vagrant Story. I did not expect to like, be jonesing to get back to my PlayStation, turn it on and
Mhm.
craft some new weapons or whatever.
That's awesome. I love to hear it. And I love to hear when the show provides people an opportunity to like, give them that final push to play that thing they've always wanted to play but never gotten around to. That's part of the benefits for myself. Every episode, I feel like I'm doing something like that. Vagrant Story is one of those that I didn't have I had a PlayStation for like a couple months. We played Spyro and then we sold it when I was a kid. So I didn't grow up with Square RPGs. I didn't play a Final Fantasy until I got a Game Boy Advance and played Final Fantasy VI. I didn't play any of the others like Xenogears and Vagrant Story, Parasite Eve. None of those were even on my radar at all back then. So I've been like kind of catching up to all those things that I missed back then. And I found myself like really, really getting into a lot of Square's RPGs from this era. Final Fantasy 9, 10, Xenogears, I played for the first time last year. Fucking love that game. Parasite Eve, same thing. Love that game. And then Vagrant Story is in that, that timeline. And it's one of those games that you always hear a lot of people really, really love it and a lot of people really, really hate it. And I'm always interested in like what is causing that such a divisive reaction, because if it was like everyone says it sucks, then maybe I'll ignore it. But like people love Vagrant Story. Some people do. So that made me interested to check it out. And for Evilise, I played Final Fantasy Tactics. I got soft locked at the boss that everybody gets soft locked at because I didn't have multiple save files along the way because I didn't know. And people are still running into that to this day. Final Fantasy Tactics is still messing people up.
You think?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
That's the one. And then, so I played long enough to get an idea of Final Fantasy Tactics, and I liked what I played a lot. I do not like Final Fantasy 12. It's one of my least favorite Final Fantasies.
Oh, killing
Different. Yeah, I know. Different conversation. But the one thing about Final Fantasy 12 that I did like is the localization, the setting, the kind of theatrical way that people talk and stuff like that. I did like that. So like knowing that there's another one of these from back in the day, more of that Final Fantasy Tactics era, I was interested to check it out. I threw it on my backlog resolutions that we do in our Discord every year now, just to be like, okay, this is the year you're going to do it this year. Probably you're going to do it. But I did. I'm here. We played it and I really, really, really like this game. Kind of like you. It was one that I was like, I'm always juggling 3, 4, 5 games for the podcast and my own personal enjoyment if it's not going to be on the show. But there's always a couple that I'm like, okay, I got free time. What am I going to play? And I always like veer towards a couple of them. And Vagrant Story was that game for a while. I was like really excited to play it. I know playing it, I can tell why people don't like this game. This game has an amount of tedium. It's not like the good kind of like frustration or tedium or something like that. It's just menuing and like going through all this stuff can be pretty tedious. It's not very well designed in that way, but the actions, the strategy that you're executing through that kind of clunky menuing is really, really cool. And so I was able to get past the menuing and the poor tutorials and stuff like that. And I was able to really sink my teeth into it. And then the presentation aspect of it was as good as advertised. And we have we have a conversation about that coming up ahead of us. But I do just want to kind of plant the seed here. I think this might be my favorite presentation for a PlayStation game. It might be the best looking PlayStation game, in my opinion. And we can revisit that if you disagree with me a little bit later. But those are kind of my opening thoughts. I really, really like this game, although for certain complaints about it, I'm totally on board with those too, you know? What did you think, just kind of here at the top of the show?
Yeah, I mean, very similar opinions. I think like it's very clear why this game doesn't work for people, right?
Yeah.
And it, for me to enjoy it, it took a lot of reading through game facts walkthroughs, and not even like walkthroughs, but there's this one game facts like primer on the crafting and combat in the game.
Yeah.
That is just like, it's a humongous document, but it deep dives into here's how combat works. Here's how crafting works. Here's sort of a roadmap, like a simple roadmap to like explain how you kind of make upgrades, because the game doesn't explain any of it. And so you do that, you kind of get that baseline knowledge. And the game has sort of this inverse difficulty curve, right? So it starts out really, really hard. Yeah. And then as you get the systems down, it gets easier. And as that started to happen, I went, oh, okay, like this game isn't as intimidating as I thought it was going to be. I'm actually really enjoying this and I know how to succeed. And at that point, I was able to sit back and say, okay, now I can sink into the atmosphere. Now I can sink into the story. Now I can appreciate those aspects of it because I'm not scared of the game anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think, like going back, like visually, the presentation on it in the game is incredible. The only thing I disagree with is I don't think it's just like the best looking PlayStation game. I think it's just like one of the best looking games, period, ever. Taking into like, technical considerations, what they were like, Square was not used to making 3D games with 3D environments and models. And the fact that they like, I played Metal Gear Solid to follow up Vagrant Story, another beautiful, amazing looking game. And the way that they sort of approached visual storytelling is just so above and beyond anything else at that time. And I don't think we see that leap within a generation anymore. I don't think we necessarily see like Vagrant Story and Dragon Quest VII being released like in the same year. And those are like, there's like just such a like monumental gap between those two things. And so in that way, like within context, I just think it's one of the most impressive visual pieces of storytelling in gaming that you can experience even now.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, we have a lot of stuff to dig into, so let's listen to a bit of music from Vagrant Story, and when we come back, we will set up what the story is about. Vagrant Story was written primarily by Yasumi Matsuno and Jun Akiyama, two writing credits primarily. Again, like we said, it's set in the world of Ivalice, a shared world with Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy Tactics, and more specifically, the game is set in the city of Monde, which was a once prosperous stronghold city until 25 years prior to the game. An earthquake ravaged the city, leaving it in ruins. sections, flooded in some sections, etc. Unlike a lot of games in this genre, the RPG genre, I guess, if we want to just bring it all in, this is not a globe-spanning journey where you move from location to location to location. Basically, the entire game takes place within the city of Monde. And even more interesting, a surprise to me, most of the game takes place underground, like in the mines below the city, or like a weird, like tunnels, or this weird undercity section, wine cellars and stuff like that. So like, not only are you confined in this city, basically, you are not exploring a city. You're going in like the tunnels and stuff underneath. This never bothered me. I did like go through the game and be like, wow, we're spending a ton of time in catacombs and stuff like that. But it is different. It's very different from so many of these games where you move from location to location and might go across continents or an entire world. So pretty interesting in that way.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes it feel really unique and like tight is that it is a small city. It's in ruins, and as you move throughout the city, it sort of has that Dark Souls feel of like this interlinked environment that actually exists. It's not just like levels independently created for a game. It feels like a location you could visit. It reminds me of, again, going back to Metal Gear Solid, like Shadow Moses feels the same way. Where Metal Gear Solid takes place. I think there's a lot of, and maybe, you know, what turned people off was that, you know, it kind of looked almost like a Metal Gear Solid game in the way that you explore and the way that the viewpoint was, but the way you actually like move throughout these different environments is so different. The way you interact with the story and combat is so different. But I think, you know, there's this city that itself is a character within the game. And that is such a unique aspect, you know. Matsuno took this idea, like Vagrant Story feels like a single quest within a larger, much larger story, right? In a full, like a bigger RPG, it might be one dungeon, right? Or one little like act or arc, or it might be one side, like one mission in Final Fantasy Tactics. You go a place, you go through a couple of battles, you fight a boss, and then you leave. But the fact that they were able to like do this deep dive into this location that ties into the story, like the location itself is so important to the story in the end, just makes you feel like you've explored a real place with real history. And there's sort of a melancholy that runs throughout the game because of that, I think.
Yeah. I like that you say it feels like this is one chapter in a larger story. The game kind of presents it that way too, where this is a prelude to another story that we never got, basically. So like, I don't know if Vagrant Story sold better if they would have made the next chapter into another game, or, you know, another, you know, work of fiction somewhere else, kind of like a Perfect Works to Xenogears type of thing. But it is interesting how it is actually framed that way. And it feels that way too. It's like, the character moves on at the end onto other journeys, and that's its own story, you know?
Matsuno did release like a little look at an outline for a sequel. And that's pretty spoilery. We'll save that to the end if we want to talk about it. But it does sort of show like the way that like this was sort of one event that then leads to other events. But like the whole structure of Vagrant Story is also like all these things that happened 2,000 years ago or whenever like Mullenkamp was alive and doing her things. You know, all of that mattered, and those events happened, and then the next phase of them happens hundreds or thousands of years later, and that's Vagrant Story, and then more things are going to happen after that. It's not, you know, what is, you know, Wheel of Time has this whole concept of like, you know, every story has a beginning and an end. Right. And I think that's very strong here, that just because this story is over does not mean the story is over.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing with like this shared Ivalice setting. It all hints at, you know, different stories that take place in different parts of this greater world, this greater setting. But even within just this one city or this one kind of group of characters, there is like a through line that goes through them. They're not related to stuff in Final Fantasy Tactics at all. It's just different stories at different places and different times throughout here. It's pretty cool. So in Vagrant Story, you play as Ashley Riot, who is an agent of a government organization called the VKP. The VKP are like kind of special forces for the government. secret missions, stuff like that. There's a siege going on at the local Duke's Manor, so you are sent out to investigate there. And it's weird how they do the introduction in 3 separate ways. There's 3 main menu cutscenes in this game. And I think that if a lot of people are going to fire this up for the first time, I want to tell them to like hang tight on the main menu until you see all 3, because the second and third one are kind of hidden way beyond the point that most people will just chill on the main menu, like unless you get up and leave, Yeah. So the first one is like a sizzle reel, like an attract mode type cutscene. But then there are 2 like very detailed story cutscenes that kind of give backstory to the siege at the Duke's Manor, and kind of really fill in details that you need. And then I think the third one is a kind of abbreviated version of the first mission of the game, where Ashley goes to the Duke's Manor, finds this antagonist character named Sydney. Ashley shoots Sydney through the heart with a bow gun. Sydney dies, but then he wakes up and shows that he's immortal. He summons a dragon and then escapes and kidnaps the Duke's son, while Ashley fights the dragon. The opening of Vagrant Story, and what I just said there, that's like, 15 minutes, 20 minutes of the game. It's a really, really strong opening. There's tons of intrigue about how this stuff works. I think that there's a lot of stuff in Vagrant Story that hints at very cool and mysterious magic. And this opening really, really hooked me, which is good because the story is not consistently on the forefront for all 20, 30 hours that you're playing the game. So the promise that the story sets up, or the opening sets up, is really important, and it really worked for me.
Yeah, I mean, those openings, like the 3, the CG cutscene, and then the 2 sort of in-game cutscenes that are totally optional, like you could skip those or not even see them, provide so much information. I almost found them a little overwhelming. I didn't really get the context that they were providing until I beat the game, understood more of the story, and then went back and watched them again. And then that provided a whole level, other level of understanding of what was going on. Because a lot of what happens in the intro, one of the intros or 2 of them, it sort of explains that Ashley is wanted for the murder of Duke Bartorba. But that actually then flashes back. So most of the storyline that happens, or most of the gameplay in Vagrant Story, is actually happening before a lot of those intro scenes.
Yeah.
When Ashley has been hired to infiltrate Le Monde, and then you find out what happened and why he's wanted for the murder of the Duke and stuff. But that doesn't happen all the way till the ending. And so it kind of it sets you up with these expectations. You think you know what's going on, and then it does a rug pull, and you realize oh, this is again coming back. It's this feels like the prologue to something much bigger and much larger. And maybe it could have been if the game had sold the way it I don't know. I think it sold well, but
yeah, apparently not well enough to greenlight, more of it, but yeah.
But it just there's just so much potential, right? And it's the type of game that the story, just the more you play it, the more you understand, the more you see how it's all interlinked. The city of Le Monde as an environment feels like this interlinked puzzle, and so does the story. Yeah. As you get deeper and deeper, and if you do a replay, you start understanding more, and you're oh, okay, this is really a intricate puzzle.
Yeah. It's kind of a disorienting story because, like you said, things are not presented in the order in which they happen in the timeline. As you go through the game, there will be characters who come in who have very strong motivations that are not revealed to you. There are differences in what you first think about characters versus how they end up being, what their true motivations were. Are characters good or bad is very, very hard to figure out for a while in this game. One of the reasons I think for this is that the dialogue is not expository at all. You don't have characters explain things to you as the player. They assume that the other characters know what they're talking about, and they just talk as if normal people are having conversations, they don't say, well, as you know, this happened 15 years ago, and that's why this is. They don't do that shit in Vagrant Story, and it
Because
can
they're
leave
all, like,
us
professionals, right? Like,
Yeah.
they're all like really high level, like politicians or, special agents,
Yeah.
knights. Like, these are people who are very competent and have very strong understanding of the world that they're moving in.
Yeah.
Even playing Metal Gear Solid, which is also kind of lauded for its story and its dialogue and its voice acting. Like, Solid Snake sees a camera and he's like, security camera. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, you're in a like secure facility. Of course, it's a security camera, but they have that exposition that you're describing, which does not exist in Vagrant Story.
Yeah.
Outside of like maybe a soldier will be like, oh, hey, that platform is moving. There must be magic here. But they're acting like soldiers who don't have that knowledge. But
Right.
when Ashley or other characters are in a scene, you're seeing what they see, and you're not having your hand held through it, which can be really overwhelming because we're not used to that in games.
Yeah, we are not used to it. It's really interesting that you have been bringing up Metal Gear Solid, which is the most expository series of video games I think ever made, and then contrasting it with Vagrant Story here, because they are so different.
And they were like and I'm bringing it up on purpose, and I'm playing it purposefully right now because they were marketed side by side. And like the advertising for Vagrant Story like referenced Metal Gear Solid, but they are completely different games outside of their some of their camera angle stuff and their like dedication to like really nicely directed cutscenes, but they were sort of put in contrast with each other. And I think that in some ways might have hurt Vagrant Story because people were expecting something that it's not. And I really like Metal Gear Solid, but I really like Vagrant Story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing with the writing to kind of point out, if anyone has played Final Fantasy 12, you may be familiar with the way the dialogue is written and how some characters kind of speak in old, Final Fantasy Tactics also had this kind of old style, Shakespearean-ish kind of dialogue. Vagrant Story has some style to the way characters talk, but it's not as heavy as some of the characters in Final Fantasy 12, for example. I thought this was like a really good balance between having like characters speak, this feels very old, the way they're talking, but not like unintelligible ye old English type dialogue. Like, I think that you mentioned the localization like very early in the show, and would like to shout out the people who did that, because this is like the perfect balance, I think, between having that flair, but being very, very understandable when people are talking.
What's really interesting is like, so Alexander O. Smith was the guy who did most of the localization. He worked with a few others, but he predominantly did the localization. And I talked to him for a feature I wrote for Washington Post a couple of years ago or last year about games localization in the 90s. And he talked a lot about Vagrant Story. And one of the things about Vagrant Story that I think is remarkable and why it's such a like important game is that the original Japanese version didn't have a lot of that like style to the language. It wasn't written like, Matsuno didn't write it in, an old English style Japanese dialect. As far as I know, that just doesn't really exist in the Japanese language. So this was something that Smith saw as an opportunity to take the, literal translation of the Japanese text and then give it flavor that would, above and beyond, kind of convey the feeling and the emotion that the Japanese players were getting through language, because that was an effective way to reach them in the English version. And so, it was something that he approached specifically for a purpose. And like one of his like great examples that I've seen brought up a few times is Ashley in the beginning. You mentioned he shoots Sydney with a bow gun, right? Like we would call it a bow gun or a crossbow.
Yeah.
We would call it a crossbow maybe, but in the game he calls it a bow gun. And this was something that Smith wrote initially. And then one of his editors was like, oh, well, that's kind of like, they probably wouldn't say gun. Bow gun is sort of a modern term because they didn't have guns back then. It would be called a crossbow. And Smith's response was like, well, it just kind of sets the tone that I'm looking for. It suggests something more. It suggests another world, somewhere where like this feels sort of old Englishly or Shakespearean or whatever you want to call it, Baroque, in a way that some of these other games are. But it also suggests at technology that might have existed. And something that like has always been part of Ivalice is the idea that there's sort of like this civilization that existed before. Like Final Fantasy Tactics, you get to the end, and the end is in like a airship graveyard, right? And it's all these like dilapidated airships. There's no airships in Final Fantasy Tactics, and so it suggests that there's this world that came before. And Final Fantasy 12 has all these airships, and so like it, even just that small like localization where he uses bowgun instead of crossbow suggests something about the world, and that is just really hard to pull off. But he, I don't know, like the way he approached this specific localization and the way he kind of boldly recognized the opportunity to reach, English speaking players in a way that didn't exist in the original game, is pretty remarkable to me. And just like I said, I think it's like, especially within context, like one of the greatest localizations of all time, because it reads beautifully.
I would agree with you there. Yeah. I mean, getting across, a tone through, the words, of course, trying to translate that, but accomplishing that also by like, we're going to bring in like an actual dialect to, like, the dialect can convey the tone as much as the, translating line for line can do, which is really good.
And you also get a point where like, the nobility in Vagrant Story talks differently than the soldiers, and so like he went so far as to like differentiate people's backgrounds and upbringings, within the game. And I think that is also really hard to do. And again, the Japanese script, from what I understand, was written in a much more straightforward way. And so he working alongside the Japanese team was able to identify that opportunity to really like nail down a story and create just an atmosphere and a texture to that writing that I've never seen replicated elsewhere, even in Final Fantasy 12 and even in other games Smith has worked on. It's just, nothing's quite hit what Vagrant Story does.
Yeah. It does feel like lightning in a bottle in some ways, for sure. It's very good. We've kind of set up the story. We've talked about like the way that it's written a little bit. What did you think of like the actual story? Did you enjoy going through the plot, the characters, things like that?
Yeah, I really like the plot. It's like, so the game took me 40 hours. Like I said, there's probably like 7 or 8 hours of plot in there. So it's not like, it's not as plot heavy as other RPGs. It is like, it's a dungeon crawler with plot elements kind of scattered throughout. And I think that kind of short runtime for the plot helped it be a lot more focused, right? There's no filler to the plot. It's really like, it's really to the point in terms of like every single story scene moves the plot forward or adds questions or mystery or whatever, in a way that, is unique compared to other RPGs at the time on PlayStation. I needed to read some, like ending conversation online. I needed to watch, some videos kind of walking through some of the story to fully get it. And so like, is that a problem with the game or is that just a problem with me? It's probably just a problem with me. But, but once I started doing that, and like I said, once I took everything that happened in the game and then went back and started watching those early cutscenes and those intros, and I was like, oh, whoa, like there was so much more going on here than I ever had any like respect for. And I think this is a game that really wants you to engage deeply and go through that first playthrough with a lot of questions. And then it has New Game Plus. And I think it wants you to go back with all the knowledge that you have and start piecing things together. It's like he said, it lacks exposition. So you have to like, read through a lot of the, read between a lot of lines. All the characters are sort of like, there's no like black and white bad guys. Like there's the bad guy at the end when it's kind of revealed like who is the actual like bad guy here. But there's a whole lot of people with personal goals and they're going about those in ways that conflict with each other. Right. And that to me is really satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah. That is an interesting point. There are conflicts between characters, Ashley and some other characters or other NPCs amongst each other, but it's not as simple as like this character's evil, that character's good, we're going to stop the evil one. I mean, that is the case at the end, like you said, but there are a lot of things along the way that are much more nuanced. And frankly, I didn't understand as I was playing because like you said, or like we talked about, no, exposition that's explaining things to me, the player. There's a lot of like story cutscenes, like you'll go in between sections of like a dungeon, I open it up, I go out in the city, now we have a cutscene where the characters are out in the city chatting, but they're they're talking about their own goals in the way the game is written. It's not always super, super clear what's going on. That doesn't mean the information's not there. This is a game where it does merit like pausing, reading a sentence 3, 4, 5 times and be like, what are they talking about here? Because there is like, it's really dense with information, but it's not dense with like, tons and tons of dialogue crammed into different scenes. We were talking before we started recording about the Retrograde Amnesia and Resonant Arc series on the game and how they do it and how we're not going to do it today is like that super, super deep dive where Resonant Arc, I was watching, shout out to them for a great series about this game. They'll spend 10 minutes talking about one sentence in a game. And in Vagrant Story, it does like kind of merit that kind of close examination because there is so much detail packed into so few words a lot of times, or like, a character will like take a glance at someone when they says something like that's kind of important in this game because those things that a lot of other games, even a lot of other Square RPGs that I really love, they'll just tell me what I should be feeling a lot of times or what's important, and Vagrant Story doesn't. So it makes the plot hard to follow, but doesn't make the plot bad. It's super interesting. Like you said, when you start making the connections, either through playing New Game Plus, and this was back in the time also when like New Game Plus wasn't a thing that was just thrown into every game for people to keep playing. Things like this and Chrono Trigger, like there was a reason why you might want to do a New Game Plus beyond just like, let me start the game over with all my gear, So there's a purpose to it. Like having full context and then revisiting those scenes will help you kind of unravel it.
Just like getting through the game faster would help, right? Because sometimes you'll have like a story scenes and then you might have 4 hours where you're just dungeon crawling and like crafting and exploring this maze-like city. And then you get to another story scene and you're like, whoa, I haven't thought about the story in 4 hours and 6 days. Like, I don't really remember what's going on. And so like I do, one of the things like you bring up Chrono Trigger, I feel like the experience of playing Chrono Trigger on a new game, like a fresh file and a New Game Plus is very different. Like Chrono Trigger is very much an RPG on a first playthrough. I feel like it's a very strong kind of narrative adventure game on a second playthrough because you don't worry about combat. You don't worry about character building. You don't worry about items. You're just exploring the story and going along with the story. And I feel like Vagrant Story wants you to be like, oh, that was really interesting. Let me re-experience that. And now all of a sudden you're getting through the game in, 8 to 10 hours instead of 40 hours. And you're experiencing that story in a manner that's like paced better for you to understand it. And like what I like, you brought up Resonant Arc. I really like Retrograde Amnesia because they're doing a deep dive miniseries right now, and they go through line by line and they read every line and every scene and they talk about it and they contextualize it. And that helps me also recognize that like we're used to in a lot of these RPGs with a lot of throwaway dialogue, right?
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily pay attention to every word and every line. Even if you're reading it, it kind of skims through your, through your brain. But in Vagrant Story, like really like every dialogue box builds the story and the plot in some way. And sometimes you need to stop and you need to retain that in a way that you don't in other games. And you learn that over the course of your first playthrough, and then you can kind of apply it maybe on your secondary playthroughs.
Yep. I'm getting close to the end of Persona 4 Golden right now, and that game has extremely skimmable dialogue in a lot of cases. So very different approaches to writing and using the space, using the words efficiently, for sure.
I think like it also like there is also an intentionality there because a big theme in the game, we'll probably get to this more in the spoiler section, but like memory and understanding and like recognition of like, is what's happening right now real or important, or like, am I interpreting it correctly? Like that's a core part of Vagrant Story's story and plot. And I wonder how much of that, is also intentional, that the story is a little hard to follow. The timeline's a little chopped up. The characters are like quite complex because you're not intended to really understand or know what's going on until you've seen the whole shape of the story.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's interesting you mention memory because there's another kind of story thread in Vagrant Story that I did not think worked. There's a kind of like a plot that you're trying to figure out, who's who's the evil one. We're going to try and stop them. We're uncovering the mysteries of Monde, etc. And then there's a kind of emotional side of the story that deals with Ashley and Ashley's past in particular. And I thought that was too vague for me to like get emotionally invested in. It felt like something they wanted me to care about. We'll just leave it at that with Ashley and things that may have happened in Ashley's past. But the game even tells you in a way that it doesn't matter what really happened. And for me, to make an emotional connection, for me, that did not work at all. It made me go, okay, well, I don't care what happened then, and I'm disconnected from this. So, I'm like amazed, fascinated, etc. by so many things about the world building and the story and the characters in here. And then they have this one thing that I feel like people should be able to connect to, or that they want people to connect to, that just did not work for me personally.
Right. I really like that aspect. Again, hard to talk about without spoilers, but
yeah, we'll get
that
there.
part worked for me because I'm also the type who like will, in those instances, just pick a headcanon and go for it and like go into that experience and say, this is what I think, for me personally, I can take from this, recognizing exactly what you're saying, that you're not, then the game doesn't explicitly, but basically the idea is it doesn't matter if what happened actually happened the way that it was portrayed. And I think like it goes into the way that we sort of like, it tells more about like, it's not about necessarily about the specifics of what happened in that scene, but the way that we sort of marginalize people as pawns within larger political schemes, right? That like, it doesn't matter what Ashley experienced in his life, because all he is a risk breaker who's there to like do the bidding of, of these rich guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. We'll put a pin in that. We'll revisit that.
Yeah, well, it's hard to talk about without spoilers.
Yeah. So we've dove into one aspect of the presentation, which is that kind of like theatrical, dramatic tone, the dialogue writing and things like that. Let's talk about the other aspects, the way this game looks, the music, stuff like that. Let's start with the visuals. Primary credits are to Hiroshi Minagawa and Akihiko Yoshida. And I mentioned at the top of the show, I felt like this is maybe the best looking PlayStation game. You one-upped me and said it's one of the best looking games. So what about the visuals really worked for you in particular?
I think just a dedication to a style. And I also really appreciate situations where technical constraints inspire creative solutions. Mm-hmm. And so like one of the things that they talk about a lot in like interviews about this game is that this is the first time Square Enix, or at least this team, I guess they were Square at the time, had to build or decided to build fully 3D games. So they had games in the past like Xenogears that was 3D backgrounds with sprite characters, right? Or Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, which are 3D characters on pre-rendered backgrounds. But this was all 3D. And so that limited what they could do, especially with the characters. So the game, despite having like an incredible level of detail where like in cutscenes, you can see people's like facial expressions, and that's part of the communication. It impacts the way you perceive what they're saying. Mm-hmm. They have richly designed characters who all look different. Their silhouettes are different. The way they dress is different. Like everything is very unique and detailed, but these character models have far fewer polygons, than like even Final Fantasy 7. And so what they had to do was like use really strong texturing techniques and really unique visual ways of creating detail in the world that wasn't tied explicitly to just the like high polygon count. Yeah. And so you have this game that with severe technical limitations is trying new things that had never been done before. And like one of the standout features is just the lighting in the game is so good. And it's all pre-baked. Like they obviously didn't have lighting engines back then. And so like one of the tricks they do is, it'll be a dark scene with like one light source. they take a character model, and then they would put a second version of that character model underneath, lit, like fully lit. So they would change the color palette so they'd be like bright instead of like muted colors. And then they'd like slide it out like by like, 8 pixels or whatever. And then so you'd see this like bright limbed line as though they're being lit by an outside light source. And that stuff just, I mean, maybe it had been done before, but I hadn't seen it. And even watching now, I'm like, how are they pulling this off? Or there will be like, fireplaces casting light and shadow, and it's all just pre-baked into the textures that they're using. And that sort of stuff. Like there was this thread on Twitter that I read a couple of years ago that took me from basically being like, oh, Vagrant Story looks really good, to being like, oh, holy shit, like Vagrant Story is just like so far above and beyond anything else that was being done at the time. And I didn't even really realize it, because looking at it with modern eyes, you're used to stuff like good lighting, you're used to stuff like facial expressions. But when you realize that they were doing this on the PlayStation, where, we went from games like, 3D games like Wild Arms, like you compare the like 3D battles in Wild Arms to Vagrant Story, and the fact that there was like 4 years between those two games is just bananas to me. So there's just a boldness to the way that they bit off probably way more than they could chew, but still somehow swallowed it and like looked good doing it.
Yeah. It really does look like people who've mastered the hardware they're making the game for, and probably helps that, this was just on the PlayStation. Imagine if this had tried to come out on the N64 or something like that, but just on the PlayStation. And it really feels like you said, they just had mastered the tools available to them. And it's really interesting with Square in particular, because they put out so many RPGs within this like 4 or 5 year span. You can really see knowledge that they've accumulated through those years and all those development cycles. Not like Vagrant Story was developed in a vacuum. So there's a lot of, you can just tell like they've learned lessons. And then 2001 PlayStation 2, like Final Fantasy X comes out in 2001, 1 year later. So this really feels like, people who had mastered this hardware squeezed every ounce of presentation out of it. It is really, really impressive. The way it looks. We've mentioned Metal Gear Solid a bunch of times, and like I think that's a good looking PlayStation game, especially from the way it's shot, like this action movie type of camera in a lot of cases, stuff like that. But like people don't have faces in Metal Gear Solid. They have very, very recognizable faces and facial expressions in Vagrant Story here. So it's really limited, like the scope of it, like. When you're in gameplay, it's room by room dungeon crawler style. When it's in cutscenes, like you don't have tons of characters doing stuff at the same time. It's usually like maybe one character is on screen, maybe two together. It'll like flash from like a close up on one person to a close up on another person, stuff like that. But within the constraints, like if anyone's curious, go watch those opening main menu cutscenes. The second one in particular is one where they're sitting around a round table having a discussion, and it's just like enrapturing. Like I'm paying attention to it like I would in like, it reminded me of I don't know, conversations in what's that? The Hateful Eight, or the Knives Out or something. Like you'll have like a very
Knives Out is a good comparison.
Yeah, you have like a very serious conversation happening, and then like characters are speaking from the background, and then like, I mean, this isn't directly out of Knives Out, but like lightning flashes and it lights up and you see there's a bunch of people you didn't know were there through the first, opening parts of that cutscene. It's just really, really impressive. And it must have taken so much time to put all that together using some of the techniques you had kind of touched on before. Like they had to kind of fake a lot of those things that you just, throw on a lighting thing now.
Yeah. And like doing it in engine, like the hip thing to do at that point was to do everything in CG, right?
Right.
To have all these scenes in with computer animated videos. And Vagrant Story didn't do that. They have their like opening like sizzle reel that is in CG, but the rest of the game is in engine, which is like incredible. And the fact that like Matsuno was looking at this medium saying like, yeah, we're ready to do this, is cool. And I think like one other thing that stands out to me is like Vagrant Story is like 95 megabytes or something like that. And so, which is like wild, right? Like the whole thing about the PlayStation CD is like HCD, 750 megs. Like you can have 3 or 4, like Final Fantasy 8 had 4 CDs, Final Fantasy 9 had 4 CDs.
Mm-hmm.
Like Vagrant Story is 95 megs. And so the fact that they could fit all of this flair, all of this kind of visual splendor and like film like storytelling in engine in like a fairly minuscule amount of data is like even more impressive to me. You know, like it's one thing if you're like, oh, we'll make this beautiful game with all these cutscenes and it's going to be, you know, 2 gigs and we'll sell it on 4 CDs. But like to take something that to me looks better and is more ambitious, executed in a far more sophisticated way, and like cram it into something that's like so tiny, just, you know, makes it all the more impressive.
Yeah, it's definitely one that like I got to thinking about remakes and remasters as I was playing this, because when we get to gameplay, there's stuff where I'm like, if they could just like, you know, fix some of like streamline some of this shit, it would be really nice. Yeah. But you know, a remake of it would fuck with the way the game looks in one way or another, and I'm not sure that I would like that. Like, there's a way that this could be remade with all the new technology, like lighting, shadows, all that stuff. It could look really great, but this already looks really great. Yeah. And so I was just really impressed by it.
One of the things, like, because I agree. One of the, like, I played the Demon's Souls remake on PlayStation 5 like a year and a half ago, and I loved it. That was my first experience with Demon's Souls. I had played Elden Ring a ton and stuff. And I really liked the remake. And then so after I was done, I started looking around, reading about it online, and seeing a lot of people being like, "Oh, like it looks awful. They ruined the ambiance. They ruined the look, like, and the feel of the game." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? It's probably still the best looking PlayStation 5 game." Like, but then I don't have that attachment to the first one, but I can see it with Vagrant Story. You're right. Like they could make Vagrant Story that looked like Demon's Souls on PS5, which would, you know, objectively look really nice, but would it retain that verve that the original had? I don't know. It would be so hard to pull off that character and that personality and that tone and texture on modern consoles. I don't know how you would do it while still feeling so Vagrant Story-ish.
Yeah, it would be tough. There's also like other little flares that kind of give it this really unique presentation too. Like the text boxes are all these kind of like jagged paper cutout looking things. The font is really stylized. Like, everyone goes for readability with fonts for good reason. I mean, you want people to be able to read what's in the game. Vagrant Story is like, no, we're using a cool stylized font. Focus on the words. Not like it was hard to read, but like you could see a screenshot and be like, huh, I got to actually look to read this, you know?
Yeah. And it feels like a comic book, right? Like with a more intentional like script. And, you know, I think that like in some ways you're totally right that using that font required a little bit more focus, got you sort of a little more invested in the text on the screen, which can have a big impact on the way you stay stuck within the story instead of kind of skimming through. I remember someone speculating that one of the reasons Shogun hit so well and was so popular is because it was subtitled. So people were having to pay more attention than they pay attention to a lot of modern shows. Like they're not looking on their phone the way that they are. They're not watching from the kitchen while they're, you know, washing dishes, because you need to sit down. You really need to engage with Shogun because you need to read the subtitles. Like nobody's holding your hand through it. And I wonder if there's something similar here, or a similar style of idea of like, hey, let's make this, you know, a little bit of friction that makes the player work a little bit more to engage with the story. You know, every little bit of friction can turn one player off, but then it creates that opportunity where the player who sticks with it kind of appreciates it more.
Yeah, more on friction when we get to gameplay, for sure.
a lot of friction, of friction in this game.
But first, let's talk about the music. It is composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto, and the music in here, it was one of those games where I was playing through it. I don't know about you, but I play a lot of RPGs. I play a lot of Square, specifically RPGs, throughout the years, and I most strongly associate RPGs with like really, really great, really hooky music like Uematsu has done, and you know, the Chrono Trigger score and stuff like that. I kind of have a thing in mind, and Vagrant Story's soundtrack is not that. It's not like a really hooky soundtrack. It's more of a score than a dedicated like It's not like they do
Not
leitmotif.
melody driven.
Yeah,
right?
it's not
Like a lot of,
melody
like,
driven.
Remembrance
It's not
stuff.
going to get stuck in your head. It's not going to, at least for me, it did not bring up a song from earlier that I associate with a character that then like brings up this rise in emotion in me. There are motifs that are like repeated and used in lots of different tracks throughout the soundtrack, but it's not used in the same way as I am really used to. So I went through the last couple days, because a couple days ago, my notes for the soundtrack were cool, but unremarkable. And then I went through and listened again. And I was like, no, the soundtrack's really fucking good.
Yeah.
It's just there to go along with the scenes, especially in, the cutscenes and stuff. There's a couple levels that have like really memorable music. The Undercity was one that really stuck out to me. But other than that, you're going through and you're like, oh, I'm listening to the backing music for a scene of characters doing their thing. And so I ended up feeling like, oh, this soundtrack is great for what it's doing. It's just not one where I'm going to be humming things. And a lot of people will say that as a negative for game soundtracks. Nothing got stuck in my head, so I didn't really like the soundtrack, which is not fair and feels reductive to what music can do. But yeah, I like this soundtrack a lot.
It's everything Sakimoto does is amazing, and I think that it's interesting because you compare it against something like Final Fantasy Tactics, which Sakimoto did, which has a lot of those like memorable scores, like that stick with me in a way that Vagrant Stories don't. But again, I think that was intentional, and there's just lots of silence in Vagrant Story. You're going through dungeons and there is no music, right? Like it's used specifically for a purpose and to pull out emotion in you in a way that's not like hitting you over the head. There's lots of just ambient like sound in the game, right?
Yeah.
And like you go through like one of the early dungeons and you just hear sort of sounds like dungeon sounds as you're going through. And I think that that's very intentional. And I think that not every game can pull that off. One of the games, Final Fantasy 15, I didn't really like Shimomura's score in that because it was more movie-like and filmic. It wasn't melody-driven. It was sort of like big swells that sort of fill scenes. But that's because I think Final Fantasy works better when it has sort of memorable motifs, leitmotifs that go through scenes and tie scenes specifically to characters and have more engagement between sort of the melodies and the repetitions within the music and the characters and the story beats and stuff. But like that would not work in Vagrant Story. Like dungeon crawling and having like some melody that just keeps coming up and that you're humming along, like that wouldn't really feel like, you're dungeon crawling in the way that you are. It makes sense when you're off on a big adventure and you're driving your car, you're riding your chocobo through the field to kind of have that big swell of music that you're humming along to. It's like telling you like, oh, you're on the adventure now. This is the adventure part. All of Vagrant Story is just so focused on tension and conflict that like you want that story to sell itself and for the music to support that without the player even really realizing it.
It does. So if anyone played Vagrant Story and doesn't remember, just like go listen to the soundtrack again and you'll follow the rises and falls of some of those conversations along with the music. I think the most recognizable one is probably the one that plays during the first main menu cutscene. It's kind of like the theme of the game. That's like big and bombastic, but a lot of the rest of the soundtrack is
or whatever those are that he always does when he wants you to pay attention.
Yeah. A lot of the rest of the soundtrack is pretty reserved, kind of setting the scene in a really effective way. And like there are a couple of songs that will pop and be like, oh, this is what I would associate with RPG dungeon music, or something like a looping kind of melody that can get stuck in your head. Like I mentioned the Undercity. But that one is like you're in this weird magical city under a city, and that song has that kind of feeling to it.
The Undercity song like stood out to me as sort of being out of place. Like it's kind of sounds like different. A spooky carnival ride in a way that was like, oh, this is like more sort of like more of an earworm than anything else in the game. And it felt weird to me that it stood out as much as it did.
Which is why I took note of it, because it is so different from, the rest of the, dungeon crawling music. It was cool to me because it has this kind of magical feel to it. It's kind of sinister magical feel, which fits with where you are. But yeah, you're right. It's like, if there's 15 levels in the game, one of them has music like this that really hooks you in. And so, yeah. Otherwise, you mentioned the sound design as you're going through. You spend a lot of time underground in this game, and they made sure the sound design kind of reflects that, especially like you said, because a lot of the time there is no music to fill up your attention as you're running through rooms, fighting monsters and stuff like that.
A lot of drips, a lot of creaks, a lot of groans,
exactly.
A lot of footsteps. Yeah.
Very effective. Yeah.
I just like, in terms of audio visuals, like if Sakimoto and Yoshida and Matsuno and Minagawa could just make every game. Like there's just something about that, like that vibe that they have that they just like nailed in Final Fantasy Tactics and just ran with. Like it, to me, that is such a definitive, like artistic choice. And they work so well together that if every game just had those four working on it, sort of like audio visual, like design, I'd be a pretty happy camper. There's something, they just feel like people who work and towards the same goals and have the same understandings about the types of stories that they want to tell through their various art, writing, music, visual arts.
Yeah, agreed. It definitely sets a vibe. I mentioned the word vibe earlier. Is like, there is a tangible feeling to Vagrant Story, outside of the story and outside of the combat. Just being in the world of Vagrant Story, there's a feeling. And it's those things working together, like you said. I know you're a big Chrono Trigger guy, and when people talk about Chrono Trigger, they mention the dream team of developers. It sounds like we have another dream team on our hands here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just feels like the dream team on Chrono Trigger was unique because it was so many like big individuals coming together to work on a single project. This feels like a dream team in terms of like, oh, this is a crack team that has so much experience together, so much like, interplay between their specialties. It's like the opposite type of dream team from what Chrono Trigger did, right? Chrono Trigger should never have worked because it was so many big names coming together.
Yeah.
Whereas these guys like just create within a confined space something that feels so like them. And there are very few, I think, like, creators out there who have that vibe. I think, the Elden Ring and Dark Souls and stuff like that would be one where it's like, okay, like there's enough here that it all comes together and always feels specifically like, Dark Souls or Demon Souls or Elden Ring. And I would say that these guys, Yoshida, Minagawa, Sakimoto, Matsuno, have that. And that's so hard to attain.
Yeah, totally agree. All right, so let's talk about gameplay in Vagrant Story. So really interesting off the bat. It's a solo RPG. It is just Ashley that you're playing as. Ashley sometimes will have someone that he's traveling with, but when it comes to fighting and stuff, it's just Ashley. And then for a majority of the game, you are by yourself, going through the dungeons and stuff like that. It is real-time movement, so you run around in real time. You can jump. There's platforming involved in this game. And then when you get into combat, you press, I believe it's circle, to pause and opening what's called the targeting sphere. So anything that is any enemy that is within that sphere can be attacked. The sphere's size depends on what you're trying to do. And one cool thing about Vagrant Story that really begins the cascade of decision making and strategy is it has a system where individual body parts can be damaged, which is something that a lot of RPGs have done. But what's interesting in Vagrant Story is that individual body parts can sometimes have very different resistances and weaknesses to different elements, different types of damage. I think there's 3 kinds of damage in Vagrant Story. And so one of the things that the game will kind of like hint at, like it's the tutorial is in a menu. You have to go in and read the tutorial. It's one thing that I think causes people to not fully understand the systems in here is that, number one, people may get distracted from just going in and like studying text of how the game works. You kind of need to see it in action and experiment around before you really understand it. But also, there are so many factors at play in like how you do effective damage, we'll say. Because I think you'll start the game, you'll use your opening weapons, you'll get through, you'll beat the first boss just by doing the combat system, just by kind of fumbling through it. And then there will come a point where suddenly you are doing 0 damage with like 30% chance to hit everything. And you're like, well, I was doing fine 10 minutes ago. What changed? And a lot of people will be like, I don't feel like the game taught me what changed. And it's because now these other systems are starting to come into it. Lots of different resistances, lots of different weaknesses, different damage types, different elements, all kinds of stuff going on. So this is like the first thing I think that will like be really divisive for people is I don't think this game is good at teaching at all. And I think it goes beyond just like, yeah, Dave, you played a PlayStation game without the manual. Of course you didn't learn. Like it goes beyond that. I don't think the game itself, even the tutorial that's in the game, is a good teacher. I think that like supplementary material is almost required, unless you like, love to experiment.
I own the physical copy of Vagrant Story. I read the manual cover to cover before I started playing and did not know what I was getting into.
Okay. Yeah.
So like, you know, you couple everything that was available at the time and it was not enough to teach you the mechanics of the game. It was only like, I think 2019, the combat guide that I used was written and it was the first time somebody was like, okay, I need to like figure out the math that's happening in combat so that we can actually understand how to like, you know, approach this from an efficient perspective. And that actually changed a lot of the like major advice on how to go into combat, how to skill up your weapons, how to focus like, you know, your loadout so that you could kind of efficiently get through the game.
Mm-hmm.
None of that was available in 2000. And, you know, it had people like really just tiptoeing through the game. And a lot of people hit a wall 2 hours in where, they, like you said, they just couldn't do any damage at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard, you know, anecdotally from people I've talked to that they just hit a point where they're like, I couldn't do damage anymore and I didn't know what was going on. So supplementary material is really helpful. I really recommend Resonant Arc has a kind of primer video on how stats and gear and crafting works that is like really good. It's not very long. It's not like a 3-hour long thing. It's just like hey, here is how this game works in a digestible fashion. Play it. And then you go into the game and experiment. Experimentation is like really, really important in Vagrant Story. So like I will say, use a guide to learn how things work. Use a guide maybe to know where to go, because it's also a very confusing and disorienting game to know like, where am I supposed to be going right now? But do not use a guide for how to fight specific enemies unless you can't figure it out, because figuring it out is part of the game. It is like, actually, it's one of those games very similar to Final Fantasy XII, where if you have the right setup, if you've figured out how to fight an enemy, you'll destroy everything really quickly. Like the final boss was a joke in this game because I knew what I was doing, and that feels great, but it takes a little bit to get to that point.
Yeah, I had the same experience. Like the final boss was I got hit twice for like 25 damage out of like 400 hit points or something like that. Mm-hmm. Because again, you commit to understanding the systems, and it's that inverse difficulty curve that I'm talking about. Once you understand the systems, once you have access to enough weapons, it becomes such a cakewalk throughout the game. And one thing I wish I knew going into it is you can never back yourself into a corner. So even those people who got it up to the like Iron Golem or whatever and couldn't damage it, they could just continue to play if they understood the systems and find what they needed to get through that Iron Golem. No problem. Mm-hmm. You can't soft lock yourself. You talked about that in Final Fantasy Tactics, like you getting soft locked. You can't get soft locked in Vagrant Story. You always have everything you need in the game.
Yeah.
It might take a little bit of time to build up, but as long as you have a blunt weapon, a piercing weapon, a slashing weapon, maybe an undead weapon, like any situation you can walk into and walk away without a scratch, essentially.
Yeah. It was really fun to try and figure out, because like I said, different enemies have different body parts. All the body parts will have different resistances and weaknesses. Damaging different body parts will like debuff enemies in cool ways. Like if you damage the head a lot, they can't do magic anymore, which is cool if you're fighting a mage, for example. But puzzling out what an enemy is weak to, like there's a bunch of stats like affinity and stuff like that you just need a little extra help to figure out what does a high affinity stat mean? What, like if I'm looking at a list of affinities, which one should I target, etc. Like that stuff takes a little bit of extra explanation outside of what the game does. Also, that
data is all like there.
Yeah.
You can access it in
There's
the game.
so much data.
But you just don't know. The game doesn't explain to you how to read and analyze and piece that puzzle together.
Right.
It's the big problem. Yeah.
So part one of the problem that will turn people off is the game doesn't teach you how to read it and how to figure out that puzzle. Part two of the problem is executing the steps along the way involves a ton of going through menus, swapping equipment, swapping gems out of equipment, using the analyze spell. All of those things are clunky. It takes too many clicks to change a weapon from one weapon to another that, if you don't like RPGs because you spend too much time in menus, stay the fuck away from Vagrant Story because
it's got menus in menus.
Yes.
Like literally like multiple nested menus.
Yeah. It's kind of ridiculous. It's the one wish, if they ever remaster this game, please put a different menu system in here. It will just, a lot of the tedium of like switching out weapons and stuff will be gone instantly with a better menu system.
Like two things. So I see this in your notes. I'm going to bring it up now. There's an analyze spell in the game. Super important. This is how you find out like weapon type weakness, elemental weakness, which are the two most important things. So you cast analyze on a enemy. You find out that their chest or their arm is weak against blunt, and then they are also weak against fire. So then you need your blunt weapon, your club, and you need a fire gem on it. So you need to go into multiple menus then in the middle of combat, switch over to your blunt weapon, go into a different menu, take the fire gem off your sword, put it on your blunt weapon, get it back into combat, and then attack. And then the enemy goes down. And I think the big problem is analyze can miss, which is insane.
It should not be able to miss.
It should not miss. And if they did that, and the game also has a quick menu, right? So it has a quick menu for magic and items. It has a quick menu for switching your combo abilities and defense abilities on the fly, which you might switch 5 times over the course of a playthrough.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas you might switch your weapons 5 times over the course of 2 rooms.
Yeah.
They don't put weapon switching or your weapon loadout on a quick menu. And if they had just taken the defense chain combo thing off the quick menu, replaced it with your weapon loadout. So you'd hit L1 and then you could hit, square and then pick which weapon and he would auto draw it. If they just had quick weapon changing, they just had analyze not being able to fail. I feel like that would reduce so much of the friction for people.
Yeah. You will often spend more time in the menu, figuring out what an enemy's weak to, switching to the right weapon with the right gem, than you will actually fighting that enemy.
Which I like that kind of stuff, right? I love Final Fantasy Tactics, and there's a lot of that in there, right? It's all about going through menus and checking, success percentages and weaknesses and all that kind of stuff. But because Vagrant Story portrays itself as a real-time game, you want more of that sort of real-time action where you get in there and the combat itself is, more, visceral and more, reaction oriented. And it just feels what eventually say Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Remake became, where it was this mix of the two. But Remake and Rebirth feel like an action game, and then you pause when you want to use special effects. Yeah. And it's almost the opposite with Vagrant Story. That it's a turn-based game disguised as a real-time combat game. but then like to do any of the actual like weapon switching and stuff, you have to go through all these nested menus. And so it sort of has the like reverse of where they really should have maybe emphasized combat in a game that they wanted to portray as like something that was a little more action oriented than what Square was doing elsewise at the time. And so I think there's just sort of that like that juxtaposition of two feelings and two ideas of what the game is. I think it could have worked really well if it was a menu-based strategy game, right? Like it's got a grid-based world layout. I wonder if it was like more like turn-based movement at some time.
Yeah, like tactics.
Like tactics, yeah, but in a way that you have a single person and you're kind of like moving through a world and climbing, and you have like a turn meter and all that kind of stuff, right? Like I wonder if the very early versions of the game were turn-based entirely. But once it starts making promises of being an action game, and then you spend 60% of your time in menus, it kind of breaks that promise in a way that's just really alienating for people.
Could be.
But at the same time, I don't think a remake should go into becoming just an action game. Like I think that the turn-basedness of it and the crunchiness of the combat is so important. So it's like, do they go with something like VATS in Fallout, which is sort of similar? Like you're playing a shooter and then you can pause to aim at body parts. Like I don't think that would be satisfying.
No, I mean, we've kind of gone straight into talking about why it's so clunky and, unwieldy to play in a lot of cases. But I loved the combat. Like I loved puzzling out what enemies are weak to. I loved puzzling out like, okay, I have this weapon, I have this gem, this is going to destroy the boss. I love spending like a minute and a half in the menus to then kill a boss in 10 seconds. Like that's awesome. I love games that make me like really take stock of what I have that's going to be most efficient to take them out. In this game, like really, that's what this game is about.
It makes you feel like Ashley, right? Like he's this experienced, knowledgeable special agent who should be able to take out, a boss really fast because of his experience. And that's what you're doing, right? You're using that experience to then equip yourself. And it really nails that feeling. Yeah,
almost like the Witcher or something, where Geralt will see a monster and be like, I know exactly what this thing is weak to, something like that. Yeah. So I really liked that aspect of it. It just got these pain points that are going to affect people in different ways. Like I was annoyed by the menus the entire game, but it was worth it to get through because, at least I'm making interesting decisions all the time about how I'm approaching things. And I'm not just like going through menus to do the same thing for every encounter. It's a puzzle to unravel. The other thing, you mentioned the analyze spell. The other thing is like you will use analyze on an enemy. And I would expect, like in so many other RPGs, for it to automatically bring up the enemy's stat screen. And it doesn't do that. It's hidden in this weird status menu. Like you open up the status menu, you see Ashley's stats, but then if you've used the analyze spell, you can press R1 and it will go over to the enemy's stats. No fucking idea
and
why
then you have
that's
to
the
hit
case.
Square to actually see their weaknesses. Yeah. I know. It's wild. And then like another like probably big problem with the game is like enemies respawn very quickly.
Yeah.
But if you've analyzed an enemy, it doesn't retain that. So if you go back into the room, there's this one screen in the game, and it's near like the best workshop that I used a lot. And so I would pass through it quite a bit. And there were 3 knights. Each of them one was weak to slash, one was weak to blunt, one was weak to piercing.
Yeah.
There was no way to tell which was which. So you had to like use all 3 of your weapons. Every single time I would have to analyze one of them and be like, okay, this is the blunt guy, pull out my club and, defeat him, and then analyze the next one. And then I would know the third one, right?
Yeah.
And that was an instance where like, even if it had just retained the analyzed data on those, it would have saved me, probably a solid hour throughout the game of having to like fight through these same 3 enemies. And to me, that just kind of emphasized where that quality of life, like the game has so much information and it just didn't really know how to communicate that effectively. Like, a modern game, like if you've analyzed somebody and then, I don't know, have a little blunt icon. But the problem is like somebody might be weak to blunt on their arms, but then strong to blunt on their head or whatever. So you can't really like, there's 6 different body parts, each with its own weakness. So there's just so much information. How do you portray all of that?
Yeah, I think that just like retaining the analyzed data and then letting you set like quick loadouts, like in particular areas, there will be a kind of tendency for different enemies. Like there's a bunch of beast enemies in here. So if I have a weapon that's good against beasts, let me set a loadout that's like beast with a fire gem, and then maybe give me a radial menu of all the different loadout combinations.
Kind of separated gems from weapons. Yeah. If you had a quick menu and it's like, okay, grab my bladed weapon, and then another radial menu that's like, okay, and now set my fire gems or whatever. Yeah.
Instead of, 5 to 10 clicks to do all of that stuff in Vagrant Story. It's a lot. You mentioned earlier the kind of timing thing, so like the kind of action aspect of this. So once you have everything set, Vagrant Story has this timing-based combat system. So you press it once to swing the weapon, and then you get an indicator, visual indicator of like an exclamation point. But it's like when the weapon hits, you press one of either square, triangle, or circle, and Ashley will use a kind of ability, and you can customize what these abilities are. So if you want an ability that will heal Ashley a % of damage given, you can set that. You can set one that just does a little extra damage, yada, yada, yada. There's a bunch of them that you can do. And so there's this timing thing. And so you can do this basically as long as you can keep up the timing. With the exception that they thought about this, that like, oh, people are going to get good at the timing. So there's a stat that Ashley accumulates called risk. Every time you do certain attacks, you'll gain 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 risk. And the higher the risk goes, the less accuracy you have. And it also like affects how much damage you take, how effective your healing is. There's a lot of stuff that's tied into that. But that's their counter for people like getting too good at the combat system. It's an interesting idea. It's not fully like developed, I don't think, because you just get items that lower your risk, and you can use items with no cooldown or anything like that. So
I was never good enough at the combo system for it to really matter all that much.
Yeah.
It will like stick, like, if there's multiple, like 3 enemies, then by the time I might be done the third, I might be at 50 risk. But like you said, then I have 25 of the item that'll lower my risk by 50.
Yeah.
One of the things like in the walkthroughs, whenever I'd kind of look at walkthrough data, often it would be like, okay, well, equip your club with your fire and then just like combo the boss until he's dead. I'm like, well, like, okay, like you can do a 30 combo because risk doesn't only matters on the first hit. It'll accumulate, but it won't start lowering your to hit until you stop the combo and start another one. And so the solution in so many of them would be like, well, just like, load up and then just do a 30 string combo. And I'm like, I can't do 4. And so like it's almost like when you're in that middle ground is when risk matters the most. Like you're good enough to do combos better than me, but not good enough to just like one hit combo every boss in the game. And so like, I do think risk needs to be in there, but I mostly found it sort of an irritant in a few specific instances more than an actual game mechanic I like interacted with very much.
Yeah, I agree. It is interesting. It's necessary to have something in there to, I guess, if you're that good at the game, you're that good at the game. There's no help or there's no stopping you, I guess. But for the average player, risk will be a limiting thing. So it's good that it's in there to, if a boss fight really starts to drag on, you can find yourself missing and, look over and you're like, oh, my risk is really high. So again, it's too easy to fix it. You get too many of those items maybe, but it does need to be there, I think. The other thing about, the game maybe not teaching you super well about, how to most efficiently fight is the crafting, blacksmithing system in here. And like, if what we've talked about already sounds like a stats sicko's dream, the crafting takes it to another level. There's different types of materials. Weapons will gain affinities. They will gain damage types, we'll say, as you fight certain enemies. So if you fight a bunch of ghosts with one weapon, that weapon will get better at fighting ghosts. And then you can disassemble that weapon.
Also, specifically, it'll get worse at fighting two other classes.
Yeah, it'll get worse at fighting other things.
So like you can't just build up one weapon. I mean, you can through multiple playthroughs, but yeah, like you can't just build up one weapon to be good against every enemy.
Right. You'll have specialist
notably.
weapons.
Yeah.
So you'll come into a room and be like, oh, there's a ghost. Let me get my ghost mace out and I'll go take that down.
Notably, I ignored all of that.
Did you?
Yeah, because what they've kind of discovered is that as long as you focus on like weapon type, weakness and elemental stuff, then the class stuff doesn't matter as much, which is just confusing because it's like the game portrays it as the most important thing.
Yeah.
Whereas it's sort of the least important of the three different weakness types and strength types. But
you can make up a lot of that through the gems that you slot. Like you can basically just create a fire weapon rather than like naturally making one. But it's still an interesting thing how like the weapons will get better at that. And then you can take the weapons apart. Each weapon is made of a blade and a hilt. And then you can mix and match blades and hilts for better stats. But I think it's the hilt. One of those parts will retain the stats, the affinities from the weapon it used to be. So I got really worried about this. I was like, I'm going to fuck up my good weapons until I know what I'm doing with the crafting system. But it's impossible to permanently fuck it up unless you just destroy weapons when you're not using them or something like that. You can always take it apart and rebuild a weapon that was better before, which is great. Like I was very worried about this.
I was worried about that too. Yeah. The crafting system stressed me out until I learned how to do it.
Yeah.
But and notably too, there's blades and hilts, and then there's like armor types, but then there's also like material type, which matters. And you can only, so there's like cloth, wood, bronze,
leather,
leather
iron
instead of cloth. And then Hagane is probably the best one that's relevant in the first playthrough. There's also like Damascus, but that's only really available in the second playthrough. But then like, so you craft at blacksmithing shops, and there's only like probably 5 or 6 of them in the game. But each blacksmith can only craft certain materials as well. So like as you go through the game and there's limited inventory space, so like you'll get to a blacksmith shop and you'll have a Hagane glove and a leather glove, and they're the right type to make the next version of a better glove, but this workshop can only do bronze and iron, bronze and leather. It can't do Hagane. So then you have to go to the, so it just like, there's so many variables to get into and to like understand how and where and when to make better items. And that part was where I just went to a guide. That was like, here's like sort of the progression of like armor and weapons. This is what makes what. This is sort of the order you're going to want to make them in. And I just sort of focused on just jumping up that list as I could. But sometimes it would be like, okay, I have this casserole shield and now I need a kite shield. But to get that, I need to get my round shield and my knight shield and my, like 7 different shields that I'm then combining into like together until I get the 2 shields that I want. So you start with like 7 or 8 shields, and you end up with like the one you want. And I, then all of a sudden I've spent like 45 minutes or an hour looking at shields in my inventory and whether they're the right, material, and whether and it's like, I love that stuff. But at the same time, that's the type of thing that would cause me not to want to replay this game, which is why I also think New Game Plus is so important, because it allows you to skip all of that stuff unless you're like really going deep on like a Damascus, like full on Damascus loadout. And so, getting rid of a lot of that friction, I think, is an important part of New Game Plus. Make people do it the first time, but then like make sure that they don't feel annoyed by the idea or tired of the, tired out by the idea of playing Vagrant Story again. Yeah,
absolutely. And like, you will not beat Vagrant Story unless you understand how to do these things. Like, it is one of those games where, like it is the game. It is figuring out how these stats, enemy weaknesses, and all those things work, and figuring out how to, combine weapon types with gems and elements and things like that to basically just wipe out an enemy in 10 seconds. That's Vagrant Story.
It's like, look at all of Matsuno's other games before Vagrant Story, right? They're all tactical, like data-driven games where you need to understand the systems. This is no different, despite the fact that it kind of looks like Metal Gear Solid and you run around in real time. Like, it is the menus. It is the fiddly little bits of information that you're piecing together to make something stronger or to get better against something. Like, that is the game. The dungeon crawling is, the shell, it's the structure, but the game is all of this menu-driven stuff.
Yeah. It's really cool. Like, I liked it a lot. It's very rough around the edges. It's very clunky, but the game, like the heart of Vagrant Story, is super interesting to play. And it was a point of emphasis for the developers. I remember reading, I think it was Matsuno who said they wanted to make, a hardcore RPG to, contrast with Final Fantasy IX that came out the same year. Like, it's so different from Final Fantasy IX if we just want to use Square RPGs from the year 2000.
It feels a lot more like it draws on the roots of like tabletop RPGs and like war games and the stuff that like initially, influenced the creation of stuff like Ultima and Wizardry and then Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. Like, it feels fiddly in the way that, like in Dungeons and Dragons, you're looking around and you're trying to you got your short sword and you're just trying to get that incrementally better short sword and you're piecing together progression, you're managing inventory, like all of that smoothed out in series like Final Fantasy. And this one feels like you're kind of in that experience. And I was shocked by how much it reminded me of one of Matsuno's other games called Crimson Shroud, which is like a very tabletop-y game. And I played Vagrant Story. I was like, oh, this is really just real-time Crimson Shroud. It feels like there's dice rolling on the background. It feels like you're kind of manipulating your numbers in your spreadsheets to make the number go up in like such a satisfying way. Like I said, like I was obsessed with this game once I started figuring all of this stuff out. And it's so rewarding to put the things together and spend 20 minutes upgrading your gear at a blacksmith shop and then getting out into combat and being like, I feel stronger because of the effort that I put in to understanding these systems.
It's an interesting point. And maybe like the last thing about gameplay that I wanted to touch on is that Ashley levels up as you play. After you beat a boss, you'll get like a little spinny thing, like a Super Mario RPG type, like, click and it'll stop and it'll be like, oh, you got +4 HP or something like that. That's the only character progression that you get for Ashley himself. Everything else is all about your gear. And so spending time in the blacksmith shop, really, like, I wish there was a way to side-by-side compare two pieces of equipment so that I, save menu time. A remaster wish list is forming here, but that is, it's great to, like you said, spend that time and then go out and you're like, this is better. Enemies are going down quicker. My percentage to hit is higher. All of those things are great to figure out.
I saw someone once say that, I wish I remembered who it was, but say that like in Vagrant Story, your weapons are your party members. And you need to think about like the fact that you're developing your weapons as your party members. Like Ashley has stats, you get hit points, you get intelligence, agility, and strength, but really like your weapons are your party and you're nurturing those, you're growing those, you're building those, you're making them better. And like the CG intro at the beginning of the game has like blacksmithing, like a blacksmith motif. It's like a blacksmith and a belly dancer. And you watch that and you're like, oh, that was a cool little sizzle reel. It probably didn't mean anything. It was just sort of like looked cool. And then you play the game and you're like, oh no, like that dancer totally meant something. And the blacksmithing was in there very intentionally because this is a blacksmithing game. It's a crafting game.
That's why I introduced you at the beginning as a blacksmithing enthusiast, because you're here for Vagrant Story. If I played the game for 26 hours, I would say 5 of those hours easily were spent looking at menus in the blacksmith workshops. Just trying to figure out what's going to be the best things to combine with others. So all in all, kind of clunky in the way it is. It comes together in the way you interact with it, but it is a really, really excellent RPG for people who love like manipulating stats, manipulating builds, fucking around with equipment. I think that like if you can handle the amount of times you're clicking around in menus, anyone who likes that strategy aspect, that character build aspect, and then puzzling out what an enemy is weak to and how to attack it, I think that this is just gonna it's gonna sing for that particular type of person.
Very much like a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
It is. I wouldn't say there's a lot of player expression. Like there is a right way to take down everything. You can't really
Yes.
approach it and be like, okay, like this is the way I like to play. It's not like Dark Souls, right? Where you have a strength build or you play a magic build, and like certain bosses are harder than others depending on your build, but you can get through it. And like this game has there's a correct way to get through these fights. You're not gonna brute force your way through, or you're gonna have to figure out the right way, get through it, but that's also just rewarding in its own way. To me, at least, I really liked that aspect of just, how do I get through this? How do I sit back, analyze what this enemy is, analyze the tools that I have on me, and make this fight as efficient as possible?
Yeah, 100%. So other than the, we already both kind of mentioned that puzzle aspect of it, trying to figure out how best to approach different situations. And that's that's strategy games. This is just a different take on a strategy game. Other than that type of player who really likes that, is there a certain type of person that you think you would especially recommend Vagrant Story to?
I just want people to play it who are invested in good stories and the way that video games can tell stories in interesting ways. It's not like an immersive storytelling type game we get nowadays, where the story is the gameplay. But I think it was something that took video game storytelling seriously and recognized that it could tell, quote unquote, mature stories or complex stories in interesting ways. I think that video games has so much in common with theater and stage, plays. And I think that Vagrant Story really understands that. It feels more like a theater production than a movie to me in many ways. And I think that that's probably very intentional in the way that it's blocked, in the way that's, action happens and scenes happen in small environments with small numbers of people. And it's really focused on how people are behaving in that, rather than sort of more film style blocking. And so it's weird because you play the game for the story, but the story is 25% of it. So it's hard to say hey, if you love narrative games like Gone Home or Life is Strange, you would like this because it has a great story. Because then you also have to be oh, but if you really crunchy strategy games with tons of deep dive menus and data driven crafting, you'll love this. Those are two totally opposite things, but they're both so rewarding. And it's just if you're willing to put in the effort to learn how to approach this game and not, check your biases, check what you think it's going to be, learn what Vagrant Story actually is, and commit to it. And it's just one of the most rewarding experiences I've had in gaming. It's the first game that's entered my top 10 games of all time since the Outer Wilds, probably, which was a few years ago, right? Which I was not expecting. It might be top 5. I just love it so much. It's just so confident in what it wants to be. It doesn't hold back for the sake of just reducing friction. It's here is the experience we wanted, and commit to this, buy in, and you're going to love it. If you don't buy in, you're not willing to do that, you're probably going to bounce off of it.
It's a little clunky in the execution, in especially the combat, as we've talked about, but I don't think that that's a fatal flaw of the game. It just kind of, you're going to spend a lot of time clicking around. It is just part of it. It's not great. It could be better, but it is. It's just something that you have to deal with to get to what I think is like a legitimately very engaging, satisfying combat system. And then you mentioned everything about the storytelling, the presentation. When we say theatrical too, I don't just mean, I used the word Shakespearean earlier to kind of talk about a kind of tone in the dialogue. I don't just mean the way the words are written, the dialect and things like that. There's like a cadence to cutscenes and stuff that is very theatrical, for sure. So you're right on with that comparison there, 100%. So as far as recommendations, there are caveats to the recommendation that if you do not like menu-based RPGs, stay away from this game. But I think that if you can stomach that, or even enjoy that in a very sicko type of way, even beyond how the both of us enjoyed it, I think this is like a great game. I really liked it. It's super divisive out there. So it was kind of like, how am I going to feel? How are you going to feel? We're going to do a podcast. Are we going to like, one person loves it, one person hates it? But it spoke to both of us. I really, really loved it. So it's definitely going to be, I do every year the top non-current games that I play. And this is going to be very high up on that list for sure. So yeah. All right. So non-spoiler part took a while in this episode. Let's wrap this up. We'll get into spoilers here soon. But first, before people maybe jump ship to avoid spoilers, let's talk about the things that you do, Aidan. So like I said at the top, you're a writer, you write, you have your own newsletter, you've written on online publications, you wrote a book. So please tell people about those projects and where they can find them.
Yeah, so the big thing, I wrote a book, came out in 2022, called Fight Magic Items, The History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. And it's sort of the look at the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West and how, these young Japanese creators were inspired by wizardry and Ultima and Dungeons and Dragons to create their own RPGs within the limitations of the NES. That was Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. And then how that journey happened to over to North America and, how it took a long time. And then Final Fantasy 7 hits and it kind of went meteoric at that point and then had, its ups and downs since. And it's sort of told through a personal perspective of my own experience as a young fan discovering this genre, living through sort of its highs and lows over that time. I have a newsletter. It's probably the best place to find me. It's called Astrolabe. So it's at astrolabe.aidanmoher.com. I write a lot about retro video games and books as well there semi-regularly. And then I'm on Blue Sky also. That's the other one. And and I'm going to have news about my next book soon as well. I can't really talk about it now, but it's the sort of thing like if you like old video games, like retro RPGs, it's going to be up your alley.
Hey there, Future Dave here, and in between the recording of this episode and the release, Aidan has announced 2 projects. Now, the first one is that book that he was just talking about. He actually did announce what it is. It is about Suikoden 1 and 2, coming in 2026 from Boss Fight Books. So I will put links down in the show notes. If you love Suikoden or if you want to learn about it, please check out the book. It is sure to be awesome. Also, Aidan started a podcast called Fun Factor, where they are reviewing old video game reviews from old gaming magazines. The first episode, as I'm recording this, the first episode just came out. It is reviewing an original Final Fantasy VII review from PlayStation Magazine. So that is a fun show. You should go check it out. It's a very cool idea for a podcast, a novel and unique idea in a medium where all the ideas I thought were taken, but we have a cool new one here. So check out Fun Factor as well. And remember, Suikoden 1 and 2 from Boss Fight Books coming in 2026. All right, back to the show, and you can hear me be like, oh, I can't wait to hear what that book is. Very exciting. Yeah, I'm excited to hear what that new project is. By the time people hear this episode, that news will have probably come out. So people can, if you didn't hear the news already, maybe go follow on Blue Sky and find out what that's about. I'm looking forward to it and really enjoy, what I've read of your writing. It's been really good. And it's been great to have you on the show so far. And we have an entire spoiler section ahead of us, but I'll put links down in the show notes so people can easily find the things that you've written, whether it's the newsletter or if they want to go check out Fight Magic items or maybe look forward to a new book, they will be able to find that easily. Maybe while I'm talking about myself here for the next minute or so, they can go do that. So exciting stuff. All right. So let's see. If you'd like to support this show, best place to do that is, well, you can do it on Patreon. You can support monetarily over there for as little as $2 per month. You can help vote on what games I do on the show and fun things like that. Treats go up as the tiers go up, so consider doing that if you would like to support monetarily. If not, that's totally cool. Ratings and reviews on the podcast apps if you're listening to the podcast. Likes, comments, subscribing on YouTube is also really helpful. All those things are going to help people find the show, and that's what we really want. And also, there is a lively Discord community for Tales from the Backlog that we'd love to have you join, especially if you love Vagrant Story. Hop in this week, talk to us about your experience playing the game, talk to us about the story, things like that. We do have a couple of resident Vagrant Story sickos in the Discord server, so there should be some good conversation this week. So that is the best ways to support the show. Otherwise, tell a friend that you found a show that you like. It's much appreciated. And with that being said, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, it will be full spoiler time for Vagrant Story. All right, before we get to spoilers for Vagrant Story, I would like to do the customary shout-outs to the wonderful patrons who help support the show. Big thank you to Chris Nelson, the Top 3 Podcast crew, Zulgeek, Chris Copleen, Eric Guess, Rick Firestone, Nick Ficori, Jill, Soccer, Cupcake, Kyle, Christian S., Matt, aka Stormageddon, JD, Doug Leaf, Jason Emery, Brian Skirsha, Jenny E., Marcus O'Neill, Stefan, Drellish, Rob Smith, Rigamort, Silcanet, Ashton Ruby, Levi, a new patron, John E., and many more. Thank you all very much for your support. It means the world to me, and it really helps me out with everything associated with doing the show the way that I do it. So if you listening would like to be like them, please consider going to patreon.com/realdavejackson and joining up. We'll have a new poll coming up at the beginning of May for a new game to cover on the show, so you can make your voice heard, you can influence what's going on the show. I also just wanted to shout out that on Patreon, if you go to the shop, you will see an option where you yourself can dictate a game to go on the show. No need for polls at all. You pick. So if that sounds interesting to you, again, that is on the shop on the Patreon page. And with that being said, let's get back. Full spoiler time for Vagrant Story. All right, we're back. It's full spoiler time for Vagrant Story, and the same warning that I always give before spoiler sections. This is not going to be a linear walk through the story. We are going to spoil a big revelation here in like 30 seconds or so. So please jump out if you don't want spoilers. And then also, Vagrant Story's story has a lot going on, more than meets the eye, I feel like. I give this disclaimer sometimes, but it's kind of like it applies to basically every episode, but we're not here to explain Vagrant Story to you. We're just going to kind of chat about things about the story that we thought were particularly interesting, talk about some big plot points, big revelations, etc. So with that being said, we mentioned at the beginning, I think I used, I don't remember if I called Sydney the antagonist or seemingly the antagonist, but one of the big things that this game plays with is who is good, who is evil. I mean, like, nobody is like pure good or pure evil in here for a while, I guess. But you play a lot of the game. You see Sydney kidnap the Duke's son at the beginning. You see Sydney mind control people. There's this talk about this cult that Sydney is leading and how people are, enraptured by him, et cetera, et cetera. And you play through a lot of the game and you're like, okay, Sydney's this evil guy. He's got these scary magic powers. He's after this like this deep, dark magic within the city of Monde, and it's not that simple. And it's just really cool how this game plays with what you think and what you assume about the characters as you go through.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing that I walked away from the game with most impressed by was when you start the game, Sydney is portrayed as the bad guy, right? He's got the claws, he's got the like, you know, the look. He's clearly like magical. He gets shot, he comes back, like all the trademarks of like, this is the bad guy. This is who Ashley is gonna have to face down. But then Sydney, like, is sort of the catalyst for all the story, but it also ends up sort of having this whole sadness and tragedy around him and his actions and his family and why he's doing what he's doing, which is, I don't know the specific. I don't know the story well enough, like the specifics, but his father, for whatever reason, the Duke. So Sydney is actually the Duke's son.
Yeah.
The boy that he kidnaps is the Duke's other son. So his brother, I guess.
I suppose. Yeah.
But nobody knows Sydney is alive. I don't know. All of that stuff is murky to me. But in any case, for some reason, the Duke can't die. And that's related to the magic at Monde. So Sydney is there to get the magic so that his dad can just die. Like, you know, because he's very sick. And he just, for whatever reason, like magic is stopping him from dying. And so Sydney's whole journey is like going in here and like manipulating all these people just to sort of like help his dad. And so then you get to the ending and Sydney appears in the Duke's manor looking like Ashley, because he can sort of like change who he appears as, which comes up throughout the story. Looking like Ashley because they need some sort of, you know, person that it would get blamed on, shows up as Ashley. And then once everybody leaves the room, he turns back into Sydney and then uses this magic to kind of release his dad from this curse, which also releases him from life as well. And they both kind of die and you're like, holy crap. Like, that's not what I thought the story was going to be about at all.
No.
And Sydney's sort of like, you know, the tragedy of that life and everything that's kind of happened to Sydney starts just contextualizing, and you realize that like Sydney wasn't the bad guy at all. Like Sydney, and it wasn't the hero, but nobody's a hero or the bad guy in this story. You know, Guildenstern is the closest to to being a bad guy, I suppose. Yeah. Cause he's the one who's just like, you know, he's the religious zealot who just wants power for himself. He wants the dark power. You know, and he kills Samantha, his like partner, to get it and sacrifice her. Like, you know, he kind of takes that role, but even he was sort of manipulated into coming to the city. And, you know, like, I don't know. It's just crazy. Everybody has their own goals and they're often conflicting. Sometimes they're working together. Sometimes it's conflicted. And, you know, Guildenstern is trying to get this tattoo on Sydney's back. The rude inverse tattoo, which is the key to unlocking the magic at Monde. And Monde itself is the grimoire that like is the magic. It's like a magic book, but it's like there's just so much there, right?
It's insane.
It's wild. And that's the type of stuff that I go back and you start watching those opening cinematics and you're like, oh, okay, this is why Ashley was blamed for the murder of the Duke. Because it was actually after everything that happens in the game, after then Sydney comes back and lets the Duke die. That's what the Duke wants. That's been their whole plan the whole time. But then Sydney, you know, then Ashley's on the run for being blamed for this murder that, like, you know, the Duke wanted in the first place. And it's just like, it's just complex. Like you don't see this sort of thing without it being like over the top exposition, like Metal Gear Solid. Like Metal Gear Solid was like a complex, interesting story that you don't see in games, but it did it in a way that was just like, so like, hey, look at how crazy our story is. Like, you know, whereas Vagrant Story is like, this is just a complex story and we're going to tell it through a video game.
Yeah. It's not
so good.
It's not plot twist after plot twist after plot twist after plot twist. There are plot twist reveals, but it's not like things that really turn your world upside down, because there's a point in the story where like they basically tell you and show you that Sydney is not the villain of the story. But for hours before that, you'd had doubts that had been creeping in about, is Sydney really bad here? Like you team up with
Ashley out in a fight.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, wait a sec. Like, you know, he's manipulating Ashley because he knows that he needs to give the root inverse to Ashley, and Ashley seems like a good host, right? Something like that.
It's Ashley was a host, a potential host for the magic. I feel like that may have been able to help.
He needed to give the family curse, over to Ashley. So the implication is now after Vagrant Story that Ashley is now technically immortal, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. I didn't put that together, but
I think so. I think Sydney sees Ashley as a host for the curse that's on their family that he's trying to remove through all his actions at Leomond.
They did say at the end that it was successful. Like they did it the way they wanted to.
Yeah.
So,
and you see Ashley with the root inverse on his back, right?
Maybe Ashley, by defeating Guildenstern and tamping down that evil, Ashley became the host. By the way, we can't get too far in the conversation without just acknowledging how fucking metal and cool it was that once you find out the key is the tattoo, because they've been talking about this key for hours and hours and hours, the key to unlock the Grand Grimoire, etc. And then you find out the key is Sydney's tattoo. And I had this thought, well, like, okay, they're not going to cut it off of his back. It'd be cool if they did. And then that's what they did.
I know. And then Guildenstern like straight up steals it from him. Like
crazy.
Insane.
Yeah. That was so cool. But, it kind of like dawned on me as I was, doing some extra research about the story today. And then as you kind of put it there, that you always assume, and I did for like basically the entire time I was playing this game, I assumed that this Vagrant Story is Ashley's story. It's the story of Ashley. And in a way, it kind of is. The next thing in this, tale, I forget they call like the story of the Wanderer or something like that's going to be about Ashley. But Vagrant Story, the game, is more so a story about Sydney, and Ashley is a bystander or like an active participant in Sydney's story, which is very cool.
Sydney's the one with agency within the story.
Yeah.
Right? Like everybody in the end is sort of being manipulated towards Sydney's end. Even Guildenstern, right? Like Guildenstern is taking advantage of things that are happening towards his goals of getting the like ultimate magic. And he attains that, right? But none of it would have happened without Sydney sort of like continuing to put these things in action, drawing people to the city along the way. And like Ashley is a very important part of the story, but he's there on Sydney's purpose, right? And like he's not there to propel the story forward. In a really interesting kind of way. And usually like non-active protagonists, like passive protagonists, can be kind of dull, but it works for Ashley because mostly because he like, they do the whole, like, he doesn't have memory, like he doesn't really know what's going on. So, his active role is just like uncovering the past and then be like, oh wait, maybe what I remember isn't actually accurate at all. That part's kind of tricky too. And that comes, like the big scene, like one of the big parts of Vagrant Story that keeps coming up as a motif is Ashley has this memory that keeps unfolding with more details about killing his wife and child, but it might not have been his wife and child. It might have been random people it might have been his wife and child that got killed by some knights, or he was the knight that killed some random child and mother, or it was his wife and child and he was like, like it just conflates all of these different possibilities and it never tells you which is accurate. Yeah.
And they go so far as to say that it does not matter what is accurate. Yeah. Which is I was going through this and I was like, okay, this is the emotional storyline in Vagrant Story. Yeah. And then when the game was like, it doesn't matter what the truth is, then I was like, I don't know what to connect with. Therefore, this falls flat for me personally here.
My big thing, like, for me was like, whatever Rosencrantz said or did, I opposed, so like the fact that like Rosencrantz seemed to be involved in that tells me that Ashley was a victim in some way. Right. And so like in my headcanon, it was probably the reality that they sort of, bring up at one point that Ashley was there with his wife and kids. They were killed. And then he was sort of recruited into the Risk Breakers at that point, because that to me is the most tragic thing to happen to Ashley. And if Rosencrantz was involved in any way, I think the worst possible outcome would happen because I don't like Rosencrantz. You know, like,
Yeah.
you know, as bad as Guildenstern is, Rosencrantz I think is like the worst.
Mm. It is interesting that no matter what the truth is, it was a tragic event that happened that was then taken advantage of by the VKP to manipulate Ashley into becoming their like super agent type of person, which is the part of the storyline that like does work to, you know, if Ashley's trying to reconnect with the old memories and they say it doesn't matter what you're trying to reconnect with, then that doesn't work so well with me. But the fact that they took advantage of this tragic situation to then turn Ashley, who he is, into what he is in the story, that's very cool.
Yeah,
and
like,
very in line with everything else.
Was it done intentionally? Like, is this something that the VKP do? Like, they go after and they identify like high potential candidates and then put them into a traumatic situation to sort of break them mentally, and then be the ones to sort of like try to build them up, where what they're really doing is creating this sort of like broken super soldier for their purposes. Like all of that, like any way you look at it, you're like, it can kind of make sense leading up to the story, you know, like any version of events. And that's the whole point, is like, it doesn't matter. What matters is that something tragic happened to Ashley, and now he's who he is because he doesn't care. He can't confront the tragedy. So he puts himself at risk and is put into these situations because he's sort of like, you know, on a death mission. You know, he's going to do everything he can sort of in search of, I don't know, dying, I guess. And then, so then at the end of the game, he is then given the rude inverse. And the implication is that he's taken this curse from Sydney's family, like Duke Bardorba's family, and now he cannot die. And so, you know, it kind of like puts him on this path that he was actively trying to, like, you know, put himself in situations where he'd lose against a fight against a dragon or whatever and die. But now he's immortal and can't. And so like, which is just a really interesting implication about running from trauma and how you can't run from trauma. Like, you have to fix it. You can never outrun it.
So that's the part that doesn't work for me with Ashley's story. It's specifically the kind of emphasis late in the game on Ashley, you know, working with the past and using that as he actually says, without a foothold in the past, we cannot walk toward the future. So it is like, this needs to be acknowledged. It needs to be worked through in order to move forward, make progress, whatever that means. I just don't know how you can acknowledge and, you know, live with something if you don't know what it is, you know? Like, is it enough? This is what I was thinking about. Is it enough for someone to have an emotional realization or to move on and live with this event now back in their memory if you don't know what it is? Can you make peace with something or live with something if you don't know exactly what it is? That was the question I had.
Yeah, that's the question, right? And now Ashley sort of has to take that forward and recognize that he does not have answers, that he can't be fixed by somebody being like, hey, this is what happened and this is how you can fix yourself. He has to understand, like, you know, he has that tragedy and that conflict of not being able to resolve this adequately because it was either stolen from him, because he repressed it, you know, whatever the case, he's now sort of stuck with it. And the rest of his journey, the rest of his life, whatever he becomes as like the wanderer, is he's still sort of choosing to run from it, you know? But is that because he has no other choice at this point?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose that if the thing that we all hope for, or the thing that Ashley hoped for, would be to like directly confront and embrace the memories in order to move on, that he can't do that. And that's part of the tragedy of his current story.
And that like makes Sydney look, you know, a little more like a bad guy, because he did target Ashley because Ashley was vulnerable in this way. And, you know, this curse that, you know, took down Sydney's family, he was willing to pass that along to somebody else to deal with without really, like, you know, supporting them, because Sydney seems to know more than he was letting on. He seems to know more about Ashley, and like he could have like maybe helped Ashley, but instead just kind of used Ashley as a tool to to his own ends and sacrificed Ashley's, mental and emotional health for eternity, just to sort of get the release from torment that Sydney and his father were looking for.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things is, so Matsuno recently released like a little snippet from like what he had drafted up as a sequel to Vagrant Story.
Yeah.
And it looks like one of the main characters is Joshua. That's the Duke's other son, right? Who got kidnapped.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole scene is Joshua seeking out what looks like Calo Merlot's daughter named Jack, who's like a seer, can like read people's emotions and stuff. And the whole plot of the game seemed to be like, hey, we need to find Ashley. Something's going down and we need Ashley Riot. And Ashley's disappeared. And so I think the fact that like the game was also like had this follow-up where it was wanting to deal with the fact that Ashley was stuck in this situation where he was in purgatory essentially, right? Because he doesn't have the information he needs to heal from whatever happened to him. And so he's running, and now other people need him. And specifically like Sydney's younger brother needs him. Calo's, it seemed like Calo's daughter, because her name was Jack Merlot's, I think. It seemed like a daughter. What does that say about the story and how much Matsuno was leaving us with these questions intentionally because he maybe wanted to answer them down the road? And what did it mean? And what does it mean not to know the cause of your trauma and not be able to confront that? But we never got it, right?
Yeah.
And so
this era of creators at Square were full of just these hyper ambitious, like over ambitious people.
You just can't get that anymore. That's what makes this era so good. Is the cost of making games, the risk around making games was still low enough that like you could let Matsuno like cook like this and make this is an insane story. Like you could never get a huge game from Square that's like this anymore. But like the PlayStation and Sony was so like desperate to break in and establish themselves against Nintendo and Sega that they like, they just really let companies like Squaresoft take risks. Like Xenogears is such a crazy game, to exist. And Vagrant Story and Chrono Cross and all of these games are insane. And that level of risk taking and going to somebody like Matsuno or Masato Kato or Takahashi and being like, hey, and Soraya Saga, like give us whatever it is you want to make it. Like, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're not going to focus group this. We're not going to like, send this up to execs. You give us what you want. And, Saga and Takahashi go, okay, sure. We'll give you episode 5 in an enormous space opera. Yeah. It's going to be 80 hours long. It's going to be episode 5, not episode 1. No, episode 5. Yeah. And then you go to like Masato Kato and it's like, hey, like you need to just write a sequel to one of the most beloved games of all time. And he goes, absolutely. I got it. It's going to be batshit and I'm going to kill everybody that everybody loved. All the main characters are going to die. And it's going to be set in part of the world that just didn't exist in the original game. It's going to have nothing like, and the Vagrant Story where it's like, this complete like subversive sort of like story about memory and trauma and doesn't really provide answers and doesn't have a bad guy. And it's actually built around like a real-time strategy game where you're going to mostly menu, but it has one of the most complex stories in games up to that point. It's just like, that stuff just couldn't happen anymore. And I miss it. I miss that level of like the ability for like creators to take risks. And we're moving into a place now where, like just today, EA released a statement saying like Dragon Age Veilguard would have sold better if it was a live service game.
Yeah.
Like that's where gaming like in that AAA space is going, is that like they just reduce risk at any opportunity at that level with that amount of money. And it's just like every game is becoming the same game. And I feel like Vagrant Story is so emblematic of what can happen if you allow freedom, allow potential for failure, or allow people to make games that aren't for everybody. It's okay that Vagrant Story is not for everybody.
Yeah, it was definitely like we often we'll talk about like, the risks that AAA is not willing to take. And then the obvious conclusion is like, well, the indies are taking risks, but it's harder to ask that of the people who are literally risking their livelihood to make their passion project And if no one finds it, let alone if no one likes it, then they they might not be able to make another game. It's a little bit different with these people who are working at Square, is like a big company, and they have that kind of security blanket to take that risk. And like, hey, if a bunch of people don't buy Xenogears or Vagrant Story, like obviously that's not what we want, but the more important thing is we're going to bankroll you to take the risk that you want to take. And second disc of Xenogears is what it is because they took a little bit too much, tried a little bit too much. But Vagrant Story in particular, like this is a complete package. I don't feel like there's anything missing from it. It never felt like there were storylines that got cut short. Anything that I went through the story, and like you mentioned the name Rosencrantz a couple times. I don't remember much about Rosencrantz.
Yeah,
I remember some interactions with Ashley. Rosencrantz shows up, is like, I'm a risk breaker too. Let's team up. And Ashley's like, nah, I'm doing this by myself. I remember stuff like that, but it doesn't feel like this is incomplete or any way, despite how non-standard and weird it really is when you compare it with especially other stuff from Square, like in this era.
I think like what's interesting is the story is fairly tight. We were talking earlier about how, it took me 40 hours, but like maybe 8 hours of that is focused on story, right?
Yeah.
And so instead of like stretching out like a 60-hour story like Xenogears, it has a tight 8-hour story that has a fairly straight like line through it, right? Like it's Sydney's invading this city to try to remove the curse.
Yeah.
Guildenstern's there because he wants the magic. Ashley's there because he's been sent to figure out what's going on or whatever.
Yeah.
So it has a pretty baked, like straight, tight story. And then a lot of the development time and stuff was focused on creating the gameplay loop and the systems and creating like just something that feels really like good to play. Now, does Vagrant Story feel good to play? No,
Debatable.
not necessarily. I love it, but like it's got a lot of friction and a lot of problems. But it's not like Vagrant Story not Vagrant Story, Xenogears, where, the systems were already there. It's a fairly straightforward RPG. Where it took its ambition was the scope of its story. And they couldn't do that. They ran out of money, right? And so like Vagrant Story, like if you run out of money, you cut out, maybe a feature or two, or like another system or two, or whatever, or you cut and paste some of the dungeon design, which, like if there's anywhere that Vagrant Story seems like maybe it was affected by like economics of video games, is that there's a lot of cut and paste dungeon design. And so like Matsuno, when he first set out, he was like, I want this to be like an 8 or a 9 hour game. But then somewhere along the line there, Square was probably like, hey, but we like to publish 30 to 40 to 60 hour games. And he went, oh, okay, fine. So he went in but you can build that out, right? Like it's not about him being like, oh, I've built out 60% of the story and now I don't have any budget like Xenogears. So I just got to like, info dump it all. Or I built out 60% of the story and now I'm going to move on from Square Enix, like Final Fantasy 12, which falls apart at the end. I think Vagrant Story is really clever because the stuff that needs consistency, like the story, it's all there, it's all baked, it's fairly small. Yeah. Whereas the stuff that like, could scale more easily is the systems, is the world design and stuff like that.
The amount of rooms and dungeons. Yeah,
just the volume, right? And that can kind of scale up and down. And that's maybe why it feels more like a complete package than some other games at the time, or other games that, Matsuno was also involved in.
Let me ask you a story then, maybe a little speculation, or ask you a question about the story. Do you think that Ashley was always planned to be the kind of the fall guy for this, like the one who's going to take on this burden? Or do you think Sydney figured it out along the way as Sydney and Ashley like had some encounters, and Sydney kind of figured out like, oh, Ashley, Ashley's pretty strong, like can probably handle this, can probably keep this contained in a way. It may not matter in the grand scheme of things, but there are some things that you learn, like that round table opening cutscene. They kind of talk about how the Duke had always been funding this cult that Sydney was leading. So like this was a plan for a long time.
And it sort of contradicts too, because you find out that like the Duke's son was kidnapped by Mullenkamp.
Right.
And then you find out that the Duke was financing Mullenkamp. You're like,
right.
Whoa, well, what's going on there? Right.
Yeah, it's one of the first kind of like mystery hooks, is like, because they tell you that in the main menu cutscene before you even start playing the game. So it's like, oh, well, why does that happen?
Yeah. And so that's a really good question about Ashley. And I'd probably honestly have to go back and play through that beginning period or watch those and see how Sydney kind of interacts with Ashley in those. I do often wonder about the character of Hardin, who's sort of Sydney's second in command. He's he's one of the leaders of Mullenkamp. He's very competent. He sort of seems like, the Riker to Sydney's Picard. Like, not that Riker would be the competent one, but like, he's kind of there as like a foil to Sydney. He's very like focused on details. He's very like militarized. And I kind of wonder if maybe Sydney, like, why did Sydney need a cult? Why did Sydney have Hardin there? Why did he have all of these things if he was planning on just getting Ashley to come after him? Right.
Yeah.
And so like, maybe somebody like Hardin was going to be the plan A. And then Sydney shows up and he goes, oh, okay, this is actually the guy.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was further back than that and he had identified Sydney. I don't know. Maybe there's something special about Sydney. Maybe he had identified Ashley, before he became a risk breaker and instigated the murder of his family so that he would become a risk breaker, so that he could, like, those are the sorts of details that I think a replay would really kind of reveal. Like, what is the sequence of events? Like, how far back does this go? Yeah. How intentional was it? How reactive was Sydney to what was going on? I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah. The character of Hardin was kind of interesting because as you still thought that Sydney was the villain, Hardin was kind of like the one who's not always down with Sydney's plans or the amount of information that's being kept from him. Yeah. So
I really liked Hardin. I thought he was fascinating because he kept breaking stereotype. Yeah. And then he has a sad ending, but he gets a really good, like, full conclusion to his story, right? Helping Callow and Joshua escape as Leomon crumbles, and then he dies at the end and stuff. And you're like, okay, like he was like, he seemed like a good guy. And so like, you kind of wonder, like, was he there for a purpose as well? Because he had a lot of character meaning, like, in terms of like, being reliable and being, ultimately focused on saving Callow and the kid and stuff like that. So it's like, did Sydney see him as a potential host for the curse?
Yeah. It's just interesting how, the story is focused, the setting is focused. The cast is pretty small of characters here. And it's just this is a genre that sprawls, sometimes out of control. And then Vagrant Story is just so much like, now there's like 6 characters. It's in one city, there's more people involved in the goings on, but there are like a handful of people who have a bunch of dialogue and that you should actually like really care about. It's really remarkable how like deep and nuanced this whole thing goes with that small of a scope. It's very cool.
By the end, I felt like I knew the reason for everybody, why they were in Leomon, why they were acting the way they were, like it had that depth to each of the characters because of that small cast. And then there were the like random mercenary guy, there was, what were their names? Like they were random mercenaries and then their boss gets turns into zombified and stuff. And I couldn't figure out why they were in the story. They seemed pretty random, but I liked them too. And they even had a little, like, when they're fighting their zombie boss at the end as it's crumbling and you see things sort of like falling down around them. But
right. But they were the first to really showcase like this dark magic in Monde. Like you might have seen it with like nameless people every now and then, and you
Right.
fight zombies as their
Yeah.
regular enemies.
Yeah,
but like,
and zombies came from somewhere.
right.
Yeah.
But you don't see that really happen. Like you go into the city and it's like this is this cursed city. There's this evil magic here. But like, how does it work? And I think the game, you know, it could have just been like, oh, well, you know, these people are undead. They've been undead for 1,000 or not 1,000. They've been undead for 25 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Or maybe longer.
It was like 2,000 years since Mollenkamp created the city, wasn't it? Something crazy like that.
I was very unclear on the history of Mollenkamp, and like I wouldn't have known that that's who the woman in the cutscene was,
right?
Without external.
The only way,
stuff.
like the only way you figure that out is you get this accessory that's like an anklet, and it says like worn by the dancer Mollenkamp or something. Yeah. You know, like it's super oblique.
She has the tattoo also,
and then has the root on her back. Yeah.
So if you're connecting symbols, then yeah.
But you're right that like they did sort of show like they were there to show the power of the dark magic, because you couldn't have had Guildenstern or Samantha or any of the other sort of like important or secondary important characters turn into a zombie, right? Because Samantha played.
You don't
her
have
role.
enough characters. Yeah.
You don't have enough characters, right? Hardin has a role to play. Samantha has a role to play.
Yeah.
So you did sort of need a group in there who was sort of opposed to Ashley or whatever, sort of neutral, I guess. That could show like, hey, here's what the magic of and the power of Leomon can do to people. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. Well, those are the two kind of main things I wanted to chat about in the spoiler section. You know, Ashley's past and Ashley moving forward. Oh, one quick thing. And it's fitting that we've said the name Metal Gear Solid several times throughout here. I thought it was funny that the story that we play through in Vagrant Story is called The Phantom Pain.
Yeah, I know. I haven't really had a chance to like look into that, but apparently that was going to be the pitch title for the game period, was going to be called Phantom Pain. And so I don't know if that must be a reference back to something. There must be a reason that like Kojima used it for Metal Gear Solid.
Right.
And it was used in Vagrant Story, but I don't really know the origins of it. It's interesting though, because trauma is sort of like a phantom pain, right? Like it's invisible in so many ways, but it is, you know, like a wound for people. And that's sort of what I took away from the name, the Phantom Pain.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just interesting, you know, maybe as you said earlier, if these two games were very closely linked back in the day, then maybe Kojima played this or you know, knew.
I mean,
knew
I read like a 2000 era interview between Kojima and Matsuno, like talking about the two games, and they were definitely like there's a Vagrant Story ad that was like taking direct shots at Metal Gear Solid and stuff like that, and it felt like maybe unfairly it was sort of portrayed as like a fantasy Metal Gear Solid. And way back at the beginning of the episode, I did like my log line for Vagrant Story, and I called it like a stealth strategy RPG. And I realized that it could sound like, you know, it's a stealth game, but it's not at all. I mean, like it's stealthily, it's actually a turn-based strategy game dressed up as an action game. But like, I feel like it was sort of portrayed as like a fantasy Metal Gear Solid, and it's just not even close. Well, I think I don't think it's a coincidence at the same time that two people like Matsuno and Kojima were looking at the medium as a way to tell these sort of expressive cinematic stories. Yeah. Whereas I think Metal Gear Solid leans into like film and like Michael Bay and Vagrant Story very much feels to me like it leans into like theater for its the way it tells its story. And blocks its scenes and directs its scenes and uses and relies heavily on like dialogue, non-expositional dialogue and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't put it past Kojima to hear the phrase "the Phantom Pain" and hold on to that for 15 years and then use it as a subtitle.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Did he get that from Vagrant Story? That's interesting. Because he definitely like was aware of it at the time.
Yeah,
like it's something that was on his radar for sure. Can I bring up one thing? And you know, I don't have a lot of complaints about the game. You know, like we can talk about friction in the systems and stuff, but like the story, the big issue that I had was that Calo Merlos just gets kidnapped at the beginning by Sydney, and it's sort of like there as a protective mother figure for Joshua throughout the story, because she's another one of like, she's not like a field agent for the Riskbreakers, but she's like a high level agent who's there and like was sent there before Ashley. And the fact that she just kind of gets kidnapped by Sydney and then dragged around Leomond, I felt was really disappointing, because I wanted more from her. And I think that she's really interesting, and just getting kind of cast into that damsel role felt a little reductive for her. And I was disappointed by that. I always like, there's the great scene in the intro where she's sort of staking out the place, and then Ashley shows up and she's like, oh, here's what's going on. And Ashley goes, okay, great, let's go. She says, shouldn't we wait for the reinforcements? And Ashley says, I am the reinforcements. Yeah. Which is just like such a great moment, but it makes it feel like they're sort of like, equals in a way, and they're going to work together. And then she just immediately gets kidnapped, which is just such a trope that I wish wasn't really in the game.
I don't want to, I don't want to excuse it, but I also felt that showcased what Sydney was capable of before you have like a bunch more direct confrontation with Sydney. Like, that Sydney's immortal, but Sydney didn't put up a fight in that opening kind of siege on the Duke's Manor. So then when Sydney kidnaps her, that shows you, well, if she is equal or close to equal with Ashley, and Sydney just kind of takes her out that easily, that shows you that Sydney is the real deal. Besides just being immortal, he also has this other, a suite of other powers, I suppose. But you're right, it is unfortunate that it results in a damsel in distress storyline with a character who probably doesn't deserve it.
And I feel like, because her other purpose is like, she has this connection and this ability to like see what other people are doing, right? She has some sort of magic.
Yeah. Ashley has that too.
Yeah. And so I wonder, like, even if like, so her being with Sydney and Joshua makes sense to me, even if they had just gone with like she infiltrated Mullen camp.
Yeah.
And has like worked herself up so that she's like third in command behind Hardin or whatever. Yeah. And so that's why she's there and she's communicating stuff. They could have avoided that damsel's trope in a way that I would have just found a little more satisfying.
Yep. I can see that as being more satisfying.
Your point that like showing Sydney as a threat, but also a threat that didn't like kill Callow, right?
Right.
Like he took her along. Because he's not there for like malicious purposes ultimately. Yeah. And that tells you something about Sydney. So like there are like, I really like Callow and I like her place in the story as sort of like this weird companion to Sydney. I just wish the circumstances of it were a little different.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of points throughout the story where if Sydney was there for, violent purposes, he would have killed a bunch more people throughout, including probably her. But that's not.
You see that with there. Like Guildenstern, because he just like offs Samantha, like he pulls her through the whole story. Same idea. He's kind of dragging her along, but he ends up just pushing her off the top of the cathedral.
Yeah, for she's the sacrifice to kind of
where Sydney's unwilling to do that. He knows that like Callow is an opponent that is dangerous to him, but he brings her along.
But dangerous to him, but that was part of the good part about characterizing Sydney that way, is like you can tell that Sydney respects the Riskbreakers, Merlot's and Ashley, but they're not life or death threats to him. Like he can handle them if he needs to. I kind of got the feeling that like if Sydney was going to be the final boss in the game, it was going to take everything that Ashley had. They are not equals in ability. Despite everything that Ashley can do, Sydney is just kind of a step above in a lot of ways. And you kind of see that throughout the game whenever there's a skirmish or, just the fact that Merlot's isn't fighting back against Sydney. Maybe she knows that. Like she knows she can't take Sydney out. And he's immortal anyway, even if you defeat him in combat. So might as well try and help the kid, etc.
Because he's immortal, because of his conflict, like his family is cursed, they can't die. Like violence is not a solution to his problems, right? The same way that violence is not a solution to Ashley's problems and the trauma that he's trying to confront, right? And is not a solution to what comes of Ashley as he becomes the vagrant, the wanderer at the end, right? As he's trying to continue to run from something that he can't ever outrun, can't solve it through violence, which is what, after the death of that family, violence became the solution to all of Ashley's problems. But that's no longer the case. And I think that's kind of highlighted in Sydney's journey through the story of Vagrant Story.
Yeah. It's a fun journey. It's one of those games that the more you sit with it, the more you talk about it, the more interesting it gets, the more nuanced and developed it gets. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just a shame that, some people are going to bounce because of the way the systems and menus and lack of teaching works. But,
and like for those people, like go and download a save file with like a maxed out, like you can get save files where you'll have like a sword that has 100 class on every enemy. Right. And it's just like, you can basically get like, if you go through enough new game pluses, you can get a statted out character who can just cruise through the game and combat's not a thing. You don't need to switch the weapons. You're just so strong and your weapons are just so strong and tuned. Go download one of those off Game Facts or wherever, and pop it into your emulator, do whatever you need to do and just play through the story. Cause the story is so good. The story is remarkable. And you could watch a Let's Play, do it that way. But I also think like the act of going through the game itself is important because understanding Le Monde as like an environment and moving through that environment is part of it. Like the city is a character. And I think you miss out on that if you just watch a Let's Play. But if that's your option to do it, like the story is just so fascinating and there's so much to it. And it's fairly linear, right? It's not like trying to watch a Let's Play of Baldur's Gate. And if you pick this one, it's completely different than if you clicked on that link, right? Like Vagrant Story tells a linear story. So, do what you can and just enjoy and experience the story because it is remarkable what it accomplishes in the year 2000 on the PlayStation.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's been great talking about the story. I came into this episode like very unsure of how the spoiler section was going to go because I was fairly unsure about a lot of stuff concerning the story. So I really appreciate you bringing what you brought to the discussion here in the spoiler section before the non-spoiler part of the episode as well. This has been a lot of fun going through this with you.
Thanks. A lot of people don't know this because I mostly do games journalism, but my background is as a book critic. I spent about 15 years as a book critic. So I think about stories a lot and it's always a pleasure to dive like deep into a story like this. I don't often get to do it when I'm writing about games like this.
Right.
I did say I'd love to write a book about Vagrant Story. So, maybe one day I'll get to do a big deep dive and write a book about Vagrant Story, but we'll see. I'm working on that one.
Awesome. Well, if there's anyone who's still with us with deep pockets, please finance Aidan's Vagrant Story book. Would be an awesome project. Yeah. Well, thank you again for taking 2.5 hours to deep dive this game with me. This has been great.
Anytime. 40 hours to play, 2.5 hours to talk about it, and I'm still not done.
Yep.
I feel like I want to start a replay after this. So that's the type of game it is, right? Like it's again, commit to it, like give it a chance, and it's just so good. It's just so unique. There's nothing else like it.
Yep. It definitely one, I play I do a game a week on the show, and I don't always think about the games after I'm finished playing them. I mean, obviously I prepare for the podcasts and stuff, but it's not like I walk around thinking about the game in just walking around time. Vagrant Story is one of those though. Yeah. And I'll be interested to see, like you said, like we didn't touch on everything. There's still more to talk about. The conversation can continue in the Discord server if anyone wants to join us there or, talk to us on Blue Sky or something like that. Great game to talk about, continue that conversation. So thank you again, Aidan. Thank you everybody who is listening or watching. Appreciate you all very much. If you made it to the end, I always say that you're my hero, and that's no different today. And tune in next week for the next game to come out of the backlog.
Hey, you there! This is Nomad speaking. If you love retro video games and you're itching for some nostalgia, check out the Retro Wildlands podcast. In each episode, I'll use game music and sound to pull you into the gaming experience while I share my own thoughts and maybe a few memories. It's a great way to relive one of your favorite games or learn about a new one. Check out the Retro Wildlands podcast at superpodnetwork.com or wherever you listen to your podcast.
Video games are a unique medium.
They can tell stories,
Immerse us in strange, fantastic worlds.
blur the very boundaries of our reality.
But at the end of the day, video games are fun, whatever fun is to you.
I'm Jeff Moonen,
And I am Matt, aka Stormageddon.
and on Fun and Games, we talk about the history, trends, and community of video games.
It's a celebration of all the games we play and all the fun we find within them.
And there's so many more games out there, so we hope you'll share in that conversation with us.
Fun and Games podcast with Matt and Jeff. Find us on certainpov.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
And happy gaming.